Welcome and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our conference this morning entitled A Better Way, Assessing Proposed Reforms for the Administrative State. This is a conference that was put together by the Program on Regulation and Rule of Law at the Hoover Institution, which Alan Meltzer and Mike McConnell and I head up. And which was founded by Alan Meltzer's vision for the importance of addressing this topic. When Speaker Ryan put out the Better Way proposals, I guess it was about a month ago, we all noticed it, of course, and also noticed how closely the topics were aligned with the mission of our group. Our group's mission, as we, I think, have defined it, is to identify shortcomings in the rule of law of our government practice and consider ways to improve on the government's operation to make it conform better, both to the constitutional allocation of power and to the Constitution's vision of limited government, as well as the broader principles of the application of rule of law. So from that standpoint, it seemed like an obvious thing for us to focus on. But I have to admit that there was probably another deeper psychological reason, which is it's been an unusually dispiriting election year for me and for many of us, I think. And, you know, each day we're treated to some either newly revealed alleged Clintonian criminal enterprise, hiring mentally ill people to incite violence at Trump rallies, or to some sort of bizarre new revelation about Donald Trump. And this is going to be something completely different, a thoughtful, critical appraisal of a set of substantive policy proposals put forth by an important political leader. That still is possible in America. And quoting from this past weekend's lead editorial in the Wall Street Journal, which was entitled Better Way for President, quote, "The Better Way plan is supported by nearly all of Congress's GOP factions." That's interesting. "And the reforms would be far more economically consequential than a border wall or even the mistake of killing the Pacific Trading Pact. Underneath the day-to-day political storms of the presidential campaign, Republicans are remarkably unified on how to restart the growth engine that used to be the American economy. One point of Mr. Ryan's speech was to remind voters that there's more to the GOP than Mr. Trump's personality and the character that are dominating media coverage. Amid important debates like what Mr. Trump may or may not have said about Khloe Kardashian and other contestants on The Celebrity Apprentice, be relieved that at least some people in Washington are thinking about the well-being of our country." So here we are. We are those some people in Washington who are thinking about that. Now, we have two panels for you today, this morning, and we're going to do them in reverse order due to some scheduling conveniences that have arisen. So we'll do the second panel first, which is going to take a deep dive into three areas that are covered by A Better Way. They are healthcare, finance, and telecommunications, and then a broader look in the second panel on constitutional law, the broader principles of how to reform, what's wrong with the administrative state and how to reform it. I'll let our chairman for the proceedings today introduce the panelists and make some comments of his own. I will simply introduce him as a man who needs no introduction, one of the great intellectual leaders in economics and more broadly in public policy of his generation, Alan Meltzer, who will be chairing the proceedings today. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The rule of law is fundamental to our system. Fundamental. Give you two propositions which I think tell a great deal about its importance. There are 25 leading countries in the world economically. Of the 25 leading countries in the world, if we throw out those countries which are wealthy because only because they have a lot of oil. Every single one has a rule of law government. Every one. Second proposition, if we ask, where are the governments, the countries that have wealth but no rule of law? There are none. None. Rule of law is quite important for the maintenance of free societies that raise the standards of living of their population and promote economic well-being and freedom. That's the starting point for regulation and the rule of law. We've had several conferences, some of them here, some of them in California, and we've begun to have a number of papers written on the subject of rule of law, and we are, of course, going about this in a very academic way. We're encouraging scholars to write papers, encouraging by getting them into journals, getting people to discuss the issue openly, create a climate in which the importance of this issue is developed and its applications become obvious. Among the papers we've had are both criminal and civil law, and what we find is that whatever meaning the lawyers attach to rule of law, it is engraved on the Supreme Court, equal justice under the law. That's not what we have. We have highly specific regulations that apply to specific cases, and which in many cases, as one of the papers by one of the papers on criminal law shows, not only apply specifically to individuals, but apply to them after the judgments have been received and the regulators continue to influence the behavior of the corporation. So that's the problem. And it is gratifying to see that we begin to get steps toward small steps, large steps. The Ryan proposal is a large step toward regulation. We're far from being there, but we are at least on the road. So this morning we're going to have two panels today. One looks at the general issues associated with rule of law, the other to specific regulations in specific industries. We're going to start with the second panel, and so I'd invite the members of that panel to come up here. We have Joseph Antos from AEI, who will talk about health care. We have Harold Fritz-Gothroff from the Hudson Institute, who will talk about telecommunications. And we have Charles Calamiris from the Hoover Institution and Columbia University, who will talk about finance. So let me start with Joe.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here. So since we were reversing the order, you won't be getting much philosophy or insight into the rule of law. You'll be getting kind of the gritty reality of healthcare reform under President Obama, and frankly, the gritty reality of healthcare reform under the Republican plan as well. So the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, or I'll probably call it the ACA, revolutionized health insurance in the United States. It increased the number of people with health insurance by expanding Medicaid, creating new federal subsidies for people buying insurance on the individual market, and changing the rules of the private insurance market. The ACA created a federal regulatory role that didn't exist previously. A regulatory role with regard to health insurance that at one time was the province and state governments, and is now firmly in the hands of the Department of Health and Human Services. Although we can argue about how much the ACA reduced the number of Americans without health insurance, there's no question that it did have a major impact on the number of people who have coverage. We've dropped from 40 million people without insurance, according to the Census Bureau, in 2013 to 30 million, according to the latest report, which really refers to last year. You could debate those numbers, but clearly the direction was down, and there are plenty of reasons for it, but the ACA contributed to that. Democratic politicians have had the idea of universal coverage on their agenda for a very long time, as I think everyone knows. Mainstream Republican politicians have mostly reacted to that rather than making that a centerpiece of their political agenda. Despite her failure in 1993, Hillary Clinton paved the way to the ACA. There's no question about it. Arguably, mainstream Republican politicians would not be talking about health insurance to any great extent today if it were not for Hillary Care and Obamacare. Okay, so I've said enough positive things about the Democratic side. A better way, and you'll have to think of that as in quotes. I don't necessarily think it's a better way. I think it's another way. But anyway, so when I say a better way, take that as the name of the House Republican plan. Anyway, a better way is the latest reaction to the ACA by what I hope are still mainstream Republicans. Maybe not. But anyway, we'll see about that. The fundamental issue that I think the Republican proposal has or addresses is the role of government. The ACA transferred massive power for individuals, employers, and states to the federal government. The ACA dictates that everyone must buy health insurance. That insurance must meet federal specifications, far more aggressive specifications than had previously existed at the federal or state levels. And insurers must sell that insurance to all comers regardless of pre-existing conditions. Many of those provisions don't work. They don't work as intended. They probably don't work in some ways according to what might be the hidden agenda that some conservatives think may be lurking behind the ACA. But that has created an increased demand from the left for greater federal control. There's a clear path forward, according to some people on the left. Today, billions of dollars in subsidies and mountains of regulation to reshape the private market. Tomorrow, the public option. Hillary has supported that. And then the day after, national health insurance. For at least some on the left, the ACA gave the private market its chance. It failed, and now it's time for full government control. The ACA, one particular provision that I'm going to mention, and it's detailed enough that I probably won't talk about it much, but one that you should be aware of is what the administration calls the Innovation Center. It's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and I might call it CMMI. CMMI was created by the ACA, and it has unprecedented authority to test new ways to deliver and pay for health care. Effectively, what the ACA did was it granted HHS what amounts to legislative power to change the way at least the Medicare program operates without having to go to Congress to seek a change in law. It's a remarkable shift in authority. It is solely the result of the ACA, a law that was not voted for by Republicans. And I think at the time it was little understood just how powerful this provision is. And now Congress is struggling with it. Democrats and Republicans alike have problems with this because now they realize they gave away too much, and how do you get it back? Anyway, because of the changes of the ACA, private initiative is no longer the driving force in healthcare. The federal government is at the center of all important decision making, and we're going to get federal government decisions, if not actual solutions. So Republicans have advanced a number of alternatives to the ACA over the past 6 years. The House document mentions only the House bills, but actually I think the Senate was probably more aggressive in proposing alternatives to the ACA. In particular, Senator Coburn, I think, was a leader where most people were sitting back letting him do the work. Those proposals, and there are plenty of them, and A Better Way have similar features. The two big features, of course, being that the first line is repeal the ACA, and then all the other lines talk about all the changes you're going to make, generally accepting the reality that the ACA did make some institutional changes that you can't just, with the stroke of a pen, wipe away. The Republican proposals do not return us to the pre-ACA individual insurance market, which in many ways did not work well. It excluded people who have pre-existing conditions from the opportunity to purchase coverage. There was no subsidy for people buying their own coverage on the individual market. Everyone else buying insurance through their employer would get very generous subsidies. And of course, people who are enrolled in Medicare and Medicaid get almost free services. So it takes care of some of these inequities. And clearly, I think some provisions are here to stay. Guaranteed issue is here to stay. Subsidies for individual coverage of some sort are here to stay. But the proposals, including the current proposal, they don't change that fundamentally. They don't change that philosophy. They change the mechanisms. But the goal is to, I think, to shift the locus of control from Washington to individuals, restoring and improving the functioning of private markets in health insurance and health care. Okay, now, Alan, you have to stop me when I've run out of time because
I will.
I could go on for hours, but I will. So
You
I
have
will,
about 4 more minutes.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, I will attempt to hit a few of the important things. Maybe I'll just stick on one of the biggest problems, which is the health insurance exchanges. This is where you can sign up and buy health insurance, individual health insurance. If you want to get subsidy, if you have an income level below 400% of poverty, you're eligible for a subsidy. And if you want that subsidy, you have to buy insurance on the government exchange rather than on the individual market, on the private market. So there's essentially a government monopoly on the kind of the sweet spot of government subsidized health insurance for what used to be a private market. The problem is that the exchanges don't work. Because of the design of the ACA, young, healthy people are avoiding buying insurance on the exchanges in droves. The mandate to buy insurance is ineffective. Ineffective for lots of reasons, but perhaps the biggest reason is that if little Johnny takes a crayon and scrawls on the wall, and Mom sees the marking on the wall, doesn't say anything, and then a week later says, Johnny, you shouldn't have scrawled on the wall, and slaps his hand, little Johnny will not quite get it. Well, that's exactly how the penalty for failing to buy insurance works. Except it takes a year. IRS has to figure out that you didn't buy insurance. They have to figure out whether you actually have to pay the fine, and the fine is really relatively modest. So that didn't work. You can't basically the ACA proved that you can't order people to buy something they don't want to buy. And the other thing that the ACA proved is that if you subsidize the product enough so that it's almost free, then a lot of people will sign up. It's an interesting insight. But if you don't subsidize it so that it's almost free, a lot of people won't sign up, especially if they don't like the product, and that's the issue. So one of the things that I think the Republican proposals try to address is to loosen the restrictions on what you can sell. Basically, insurance companies have been in the business of selling health insurance for, probably upwards of 80 or 90 years now, and they got pretty good at it. They had some rules that kept people out of that coverage. You change those rules, you've got to do something about it. And you have to do something to get the young, healthy people to sign up, or you have to admit that you can't do that, and then you have to admit that you're going to have to subsidize that market in some other way, meaning taxpayers will get to dig in deeper. What have we seen with the exchanges? What's the experience? Well, United Healthcare, Aetna, the major insurers have announced this year that they're going to pull out of many of the exchange markets. The reason is they're losing money hand over fist in those markets. They're staying in the markets where they were already well established and where there wasn't much at stake financially, but they basically can't stay in a market where they're losing literally hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and that's the situation. The Obama administration doesn't seem to accept that, but the Clinton administration will undoubtedly apply all of the legal and extra-legal authorities that they have to browbeat, cajole, or force insurance companies to do what they want. That probably will include, again, some hidden additional subsidies to bring them back in the fold. What do Republicans suggest? On this, I have to say I'm a little skeptical, but the idea is, again, to try to get young people to sign up. So instead of having a mandate, the Republican proposal is to give what I think is actually a relatively weak positive incentive to buy insurance. And that is, if you buy insurance and you remain insured, leaving aside what that insurance actually covers. But if you buy coverage and you remain insured, then you don't have to worry about having your premiums go up if you become sick. Well, that's pretty good if you're an analyst, but if you're a normal human being, especially if you're a young, normal human being, and if you're male, it's, I'm not sick, I'll never get sick, I don't need that, and I got a bar bill to pay. So I'm not so sure that's going to work, but I do respect bar bills. High-risk pools, that's a more, I think that's a more standard idea. It's a good idea. You take the really sick people out of the general pool, and you admit that we're going to subsidize their care. But that only works if you admit that you're going to subsidize their care instead of what most states did, which was the states that created high-risk pools essentially made it difficult to get better from a financial standpoint, and then realized that it was costing them too much money and limited the funding, basically making the high-risk pools, in most cases, collapse. And then finally, an idea that that is not in the Republican proposal, then I'll stop talking, is something called default enrollment. This is something that many of us have talked about, and the idea is that give the states an option to give people who didn't voluntarily enroll in health insurance some coverage, catastrophic coverage, that is whose value is equal to the subsidy that they're being given by the government. In other words, they don't have to sign up for coverage actively to get this coverage. I don't view this as insurance for people. I view this as money for insurance companies. It is a way to put more money into the system. It's kind of a ham-handed way of doing a high-risk pool in a sense. It's a fairly complicated idea, but generally all of these ideas are trying to get at how do you get a more stable risk pool, and how do you conceal the subsidies that have to go in to a part of the insurance market that naturally isn't going to be able to afford middle-class coverage.
Thank you. I hope in the question period you'll explain to us how, with 110 trillion, that's with a T, trillion dollars of unfunded liabilities, we're going to be able to put new additional big subsidies into the healthcare system. I think there's a problem there for Democrats as well as Republicans. That is, there ain't enough money to pay for the subsidies we've already put in. And we're going to have to face the question of how we come up with a healthcare system which doesn't have those problems, if such a system may exist. All right. Next,
Exactly. Yeah.
Charles Calamiris has helped me and Mike greatly in sponsoring these meetings, and he's going to talk to us about financial regulation.
Thanks, Alan. That usually is the signal for most people to go to sleep, but I'm going to try to convince you that you should not go to sleep. Thanks very much. So the first point I'm going to make very briefly is after now 6 years under the Dodd-Frank reforms and some other reforms, the CARD Act in 2009, now we've had more than 6 years under these reforms, and we've actually had a huge amount of academic research about them, which I can summarize in one sentence. They're a flop. The banking system is a disaster, and the financial system more generally has been significantly harmed, and we can conclude it has been harmed by the regulatory changes. So what are the things that the regulatory changes that were enacted would themselves regard as indicative of problems? Well, suppose that the regulations caused a lot of activities to migrate out of the regulatory system into that dreaded shadow system. Well, a lot of this research shows that that's happened. Or suppose that the regulations like the interchange fee actually caused offsetting fees to arise equal in amount to the fees that were canceled. Well, we've got evidence of that. Or suppose that the bond market, the over-the-counter bond market, has basically collapsed in terms of maintained inventories by intermediaries so that there's no longer going to be a very orderly bond market. Well, that's happened. Or suppose the qualified mortgage standard and qualified residential mortgage standard, which were supposed to create stable mortgages in an environment where people could repay their mortgages. Suppose that I told you that those had been lobbied out of existence and even criticized very vociferously by their architect, Barney Frank, as being ineffectual due to political lobbying of the so-called Coalition for Sensible Housing, which did the predictable thing after they were passed, and that is lobbied to make sure the regulators didn't enforce the intent of those. All right, or suppose I told you that things like guidance on leveraged loans that the Federal Reserve is doing as part of its new macroprudential mandate had been found to be completely a failure by the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, because non-regulated lenders had simply made up the slack for whatever reduction in lending had been occurring at the regulated banks as a result of the new guidance. So the point is, when I say the jury is in and reform is a flop, I'm not exaggerating. There's a very large amount of academic research that basically says it's not working. I left out risk weights. So banks measure their own risks and then budget capital accordingly. And of course, you can really get a great publication, as many of these publications show, in finance simply by looking into whether the banks game those risks. Predictably, I know you're going to be shocked to hear, they understate, not overstate, the riskiness of the loans that they have to. It's random, could have been either. Turns out it's understate. So the point is, as I said yesterday when I was debating Barney Frank at the New York Bankers Association meetings on the same topic, look, I don't blame you, Barney. You just doubled down on a history of bad ideas, not understanding that they weren't working before, and they're not working now any better. So enter a better way. And what can we say about a better way? First thing I'd like to commend about it is it has lots of specifics. I'm not going to be able to go through everything. I'll show you some slides, and you can get my slides later, and I'm happy to talk more in the question session. Lots of specifics, and many of them are connected to specific bills that already exist. Secondly, there is an integrated philosophy that's reflected in the proposals. Minimizing regulatory burdens, maximizing consumer choice, removing distortions that are making things unnecessarily costly, and restoring market discipline rather than government control. So these are, I think, pretty good principles for regulation. So let me start. There are many different pieces. Unlike healthcare, where it's pretty much all the same objective, people get sick and you try to help them. Financial services are a lot of different things. So one thing that the Dodd-Frank Act created was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. And a better way recognizes that what's the central wrong sort of design of the CFPB is the government isn't just ensuring that consumers get reliable information in order to make their own choices. It's substituting government regulator judgment for individual choice. It also recognizes that too many minority and low-income mortgage borrowers are not getting mortgages right now. So which principle is that illustrative of? That's the principle called we need to get elected. In other words, why are they focusing so much on the failure of people to get mortgages? And that shows you that the problems that we had leading up to the subprime crisis were very much a bipartisan failure to get real about the creation of risk in the mortgage system. And unfortunately, that's a major failing of a better way, because after all, the Republican Party also has to stand for elections. And it's not very popular to say that we want to have a mortgage system based on ability to repay mortgages. What's much more popular is to say too many people aren't getting mortgages who would like one. I would also like many mortgages, and I've got a tin pan outside. If you'd like to leave a contribution so that I can qualify for many more mortgages, I'd be very happy. So it's a little bit disappointing, but there's a lot of other good things here on the consumer side, recognizing that credit card borrowers have been squeezed by the Card Act. There's a recent study by the Federal Reserve Board, a couple of economists there, showing that the constraints on the pricing of risk in the Card Act of 2009 did something predictable. Guess what? They made banks unwilling to provide risky credit cards. So that if you were a risky credit card customer, you've migrated out of the credit card business into the shadow consumer finance area. This was something that Barney Frank was not very pleased to hear yesterday, because he's sure that that couldn't be true. He said so. I was shocked by the fact that I wasn't making an argument. I was just telling him a fact. That's what this study documents. So there's a recognition that consumers are also confused about what's going on in their checking accounts. Fees have gone up. Guess why fees have gone up for checking accounts? Mainly because of the interchange fee, the Durbin Act. That's where the money came back. So when the interchange fee was done away, there are lots of overdraft fees now associated that make up that difference. In a competitive system, you got to get paid one way or the other. Also, it criticizes, the Better Way criticizes the new fiduciary responsibilities that brokers have, and points out that this is going to reduce the amount of advice people can get about their retirement options. Again, I think they're right about this. So a lot of good points, but some disappointing ones too. They want to make the CFPB bipartisan. They want to make it a 5-member commission. subject to the appropriations by Congress, accountable and transparent. They want to establish an inspector general. They want it to stop banning products and end its authority to be able to ban products. They want it to stop trying to prohibit mandatory arbitration clauses. There's a long list of things here. But then you'll also see they want to give small banks relief from a lot of regulation, especially even capital regulation. But I have news for them. Small banks also fail. We have had waves of small bank failures that have been very destructive. If you weren't around in the 1980s, ask an older person to remind you what that was like. Small banks are popular. Large banks are not popular politically, and so small banks, I think they do deserve a lot of regulatory relief, don't get me wrong, but the point is it's not a coincidence that expanding mortgage access and helping small bankers is as popular today as it was 150 years ago for politicians. Okay, I know in the interest of time I'm going to move on. What about prudential regulation? Well, here, A Better Way notes that the Basel rules are overly complex, badly designed, and very costly to implement. I agree with them. What's better? And they say, well, what's better? And here I like this principle very much. If banks are well capitalized, let's put very high capital standards for banks, and if they meet them, then stop micromanaging what banks can do. Let banks define their own businesses once it's clear that they're betting their own money, they're not betting the taxpayers' money. But how exactly to measure that high capitalization? I have some things to say about that in a minute. I think that book value of equity is it's a necessary but insufficient measure by itself to ensure that banks are well capitalized. And so I'm a little worried about whether we'll be able to do that very effectively. And then, of course, we want to end bailouts. Another thing that's very unpopular in America are bailouts. And it correctly notes that Title II of Dodd-Frank, while it claims the opposite, actually codified bailouts by creating designated so-called SIFIs and procedures that would actually bail them out. Now, in Washington, language is an interesting thing. So instead of the tax that would pay for those bailouts, those are called fees, and fees should never be confused with taxes, because taxes are things that you charge people who are making money in order to pay for things that the government does. Fees are entirely different from that. They're things that you charge people who are making money in order to pay for things that the governments do. So I hope I've cleared that up. Now, it wants to do a lot of things, substitute a new bankruptcy code. In fact, Stanford at the Hoover Institution had a lot to do with the development of that set of proposals. I want to say I think these are principled and good ideas. I'm not sure they're going to work. And I think that, but they're definitely respectable intellectual ideas that are worth talking about, and they're taking us in a good direction. What about the FSOC? Well, the FSOC is this new creature. It has a lot of problems. It's unaccountable effectively, completely unaccountable. It can decide to designate any firm in the United States, probably each of us individually, as systemically risky. I think I've been accused by some finance ministers of foreign countries as being systemically risky. And I think that I'm worried that the FSOC might decide that I am systemically risky. They could do that with any company they want, impose all sorts of requirements on them without really any accountability. So they want to end the SIFI designation, create accountability. One procedural problem is that the FSOC is inherently a politicized structure, not only because the Secretary of the Treasury is the head of the FSOC, but because members of the FSOC are only the chairman of the regulatory bodies. And that means that it's all people from the same political party. Unlike, let's say, the SEC, which was created to be bipartisan, the FSOC is completely partisan because the chairman of all of these agencies is always from the same political party. So when you have only those people gathered together in the FSOC, you've created by design a hyper-partisan institution. So change that by letting all commission members and boards attend and participate in FSOC meetings, restore more authority to the primary regulators, and some other technical issues. Again, I support this. I think these are good procedural reforms, especially having to do with supporting rule of law limits on this sort of unbridled discretionary authority.
You have 1 minute.
Thanks. So with respect to the Fed, require that the Fed have an explicit strategy. This is something that many economists, including Alan Meltzer, John Taylor, and I, and many of our colleagues have pointed out is necessary. And then furthermore, as part of rule of law for executive authority, to subject prudential regulatory activities of the Fed and others to congressional oversight and appropriations. If you're spending money as a regulator, you should be subject to appropriations. So again, good procedural ideas. What about with end users? Not covered by any of the prior proposals. Basically, they say some good things about reducing reporting burdens that are excessive for certain end users. That means regular old companies and consumers. And they have a laundry list of some other things that are pretty good. Now, what's missing here is the big picture of why, especially prudential regulatory ideas like relying on book equity ratios have failed, and not just in the U.S., but in many other countries. Here's I know Alan will like this especially, a cartoon from the New Yorker with two guys saying, the new regulations will fundamentally change the way we get around them. And my point is, one of these people is a banker and the other one is a politician and regulator, meaning that this is really a conspiracy of agents, of agency problems. Neither of them has the incentive. And so what we really need to focus on is incentives of bankers and incentives of agents, supervisors and politicians. And we have to create, and I've separately myself designed regulations that address these deficiencies in our prudential structure. I won't have time to talk about them, but I give you a list, and I'm happy to talk about how that would work better, and with an emphasis on process reform and an emphasis on simplicity, because only simplicity creates accountability, because outsiders have to be able to see whether the bankers and the regulators are actually creating a stable system, and without simplicity you can't. And then my final slide, Alan, don't worry. So by my grading, overall, I give the Dodd-Frank Act, the Credit Card Act, an F, and I give the Better Way a B. It has a lot of good principles behind it. They're very specific. There's a lot that's good. There's some unfortunate things, and more generally, I think it still lacks a vision for reforming prudential regulation that's going to be very effective. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Let me say a few words about how all this got started. I was asked to talk about regulation by the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Instead of speaking about Dodd-Frank, I talked about regulation as a source of corruption, circumvention, and the first speaker who got up from the audience was a Wall Street lawyer who said, "Who do you think shows them how to circumvent the law?" Well, I thought, that's great. Congress passes laws, the president signs them, and here are people getting well paid to circumvent them. I wonder how general that is. Well, it turns out terribly general. That's how regulation and the rule of law began. And with the aid of good colleagues, we've been able to move forward. And speaking of moving forward, let me introduce Harold Fritchgoth-Roth, an old friend, former colleague when we both were at AEI. Harold is going to talk to us about communication problems.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to the Hoover Institution for having me here today. It's a great honor to speak about a better way, and I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on how to, let's say, improve a better way. Joe and Charlie talked about the specific sectors, healthcare, banking and finance, and there is a characteristic of both of those where you have a law and you have regulations that directly are under the law. A lot of my activities in a different sector, the communication sector, where there are regulations and there's whether they relate to the law or not is a different matter. Alan focused on getting to a rule of law, and I think that's very important. And in the communication sector, we're really not very close to what I would call a rule of law. And I would also say that regulatory reform is not a new idea. Much of what is in a better way could have been written 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Congress has passed a lot of laws on regulatory reform. In the mid-1990s, I was chief economist of the House Commerce Committee, which meant I was essentially the only economist on an authorizing committee staff. And I was in charge of anything related to regulatory reform. And Congress passed a lot of laws on regulatory reform. They've had absolutely no effect on, at least on the communications sector. You could write into law everything that's in a better way. It would have no effect at all on what goes on at the FCC today. There are a few exceptions, and I'm going to focus on those. But I'm going to begin just with a little bit of a story. Up until the age of 12, I grew up in South Knoxville, Tennessee, which was a very rough and tumble world. And it's a world where fighting was the general pastime. There were stick fights and dog fights and stone fights, and fighting was just what everyone talked about all the time. There was no rule of law. But let me tell you, at the end of the day, there actually weren't a lot of fights because there was something called query boys. And query boys was the local term used for the boys who grew up at the quarry in part of South Knoxville. And they were the toughest people, and everyone knew it. And you didn't mess around with these people. And any time there was a fight that started, someone would say, "Here come the query boys." And that would end the fight right there. I say this because at the end of the day, a better way is not really aimed at people on the outside. It's aimed at the Republican caucus in Congress. And why do I say that? It's aimed at the Republican caucus in Congress because you read things and you sort of say, well, if, pretty please, members of Congress, talk to your constituents, or I'm going to ask pretty please that the chairman of the committees will do authorizing legislation. They don't. This document is really aimed at them. And what has been missing for a very long time, is a query boy mentality about how to get things done. And so my comments are going to be very much focused on how do you improve a better way? How do you actually get something done so that the members, instead of sort of saying, well, we've passed laws and it's not going to make any difference, the people over the FCC, they really don't care. They don't really care about what goes on in Capitol Hill. They don't care what the law is. How do you get them to sort of say, uh-oh, the query boys are coming, we better get in line? First of all, it's important to frame deregulation, and I think Joe and Charlie have done that very well. The view that there is too much regulation in America is unfortunately not the dominant view. I was at a conference last week, and Nobel laureate in economics, I think a colleague of yours, Professor Calamiris, was describing what's wrong with the American economy. And I kid you not, in front of a very large, august audience, he said the primary cause of the slowdown in the American economy over the past generation is deregulation.
Interesting.
Now, I practically fell out of my chair, but this view is being taught to millions of college students every year. This is the mainstream view of academic America, that there is too much deregulation. The reality is the exact opposite.
Any deregulation is too much.
But it's not just pointy-headed academics. Like many of you, I've spoken in many states around the country about deregulation, about the importance of it. And invariably, at the end of the talk, someone buttonholes me after the speech and says, I agree with 99% of what you said, but let me tell you about industry X. Too much deregulation, whether it's airlines, whether sometimes it's banking, whether it's healthcare. It's always someone says, you know what, they got it wrong there. There was just too much deregulation. And these individuals are not isolated cranks. This is the widespread view throughout much of America. We have lost the public argument that what is destroying America, what is causing economic slowdown, is too much regulation. We have not succeeded in that argument. So when it comes to this dogfight, let me add the other part of this. If you look at every FCC docket and you look at the comments, you will rarely find comments that say, you know, the problem is we have too much regulation. Why are you doing this? Invariably, it's industry and it's major businesses sort of saying, well, you know, it's sort of all right, but you know, just tweak it here and everything will be just fine. I'm reminded of a story. I was an undergrad at MIT, and there was a popular story. There were three college kids who went out, and they got into an awful lot of trouble one night, and the town elders of Boston caught them and sentenced them all to die by guillotine. And the first guy was from Boston College, and they said, "Do you have any last words to say?" He said, "Tell my mom I loved her." And so the guillotine goes and stops just a hair above his neck. And the town elder said, well, you know, the kid loves his mom, we'll let him go. The next kid is from Harvard. They say, got anything to say for yourself? And he says, tell my alma mater I loved her. And so the guillotine comes down, stops right above his neck. And they said, well, you know, Harvard has a lot of stroke upstairs. We better let him go. And the last kid is from MIT. And they say, do you have any last words? And he says, you know, if you adjust the knot up there, I think it might work a little better. That's exactly what happens every day at the FCC when businesses go in and comment on rulemaking. And they all say, well, if you just adjust it a little bit better here, you know, we're going to do all right. Well, no, because the whole system doesn't work. The whole system doesn't work. And yet, you have businesses allied with the academics, allied with people around America who think that there's been too much deregulation, allied with the kind of self-anointed public interest groups who say, you know, all regulation is good, and then we wind up with more regulation. So how do we get out of this situation? I think there's one element of one theme in a better way that is really important, and that is to get Congress more in charge through the budget process. To say every year Congress is going to authorize every agency, and instead of having the pretty please, why don't you do this, frankly, the document from the Speaker's office should be, there are two types of chairmen. There are chairmen and there are former chairmen. And here is the authorizing language, and it is going to be for this fiscal year, and that's that. And the same thing with the appropriators. And you don't put this in writing. Also, you know, it's nice to have a better way in writing, but actually a lot of the important contents should never be written down. You don't want to have these public discussions about how these things are done. I assure you, query boys never write anything down. They don't know how to write. But they're far more effective than the pointy-headed people who do. The other thing that I think is missing from a better way completely is to empower the American individuals who are harmed by excessive regulation. And let me describe a few ways that this can be done and should be done. Right now, and the reason I'm very skeptical about new rules on cost-benefit analysis or IRA review or major regulatory review, that all goes on right now today. And guess who does the cost-benefit analysis? It's the economists who were trained at the schools where the people say there's been too much deregulation. And it's not going to change if we get, someone in power. It's the whole construct of cost-benefit analysis is to say the government can step in and control property as long as the benefits exceed the cost. And coming up with these measures of, there's $1.89 trillion of cost of regulation. It's mind-boggling to even think that you can quantify most of the cost of regulation. No, what you need to be able to say is if an individual is harmed, they have standing to go to court. And by the way, every step in the process right now, in the regulatory process, if you disagree with it, an individual can go to court. The FCC goes through mind-numbing detail of doing cost-benefit analysis for this law and that law and the other thing, and if they do it wrong, there's no court review. Zero. No one has standing. It doesn't matter. So the FCC can make it up, and guess what? They do. And a lot of agencies are in this situation. So what you need to do is to sort of say ordinary Americans who are harmed by regulation have standing to go into court and take steps against these regulations. You combine empowering ordinary Americans to be part of the Query Boy Coalition, together with empowering Congress to sort of say, we're sick and tired of these agencies disregarding us. If you want to see something funny, go look at an FCC oversight hearing on Capitol Hill. You'll have congressmen telling them they're doing a bad job, and you'll have commissioners sort of say, what are you going to do about it? You're not going to do anything. You're just a member of Congress. Are you serious? So what I'm suggesting is, ultimately you need to put together what I'd call a Query Boy Coalition, and you need a Speaker of the House, you need some leadership in Congress who are just really tough, and they're not going to take any nonsense, and they're going to put congressional committees in charge as they ought to be, and they're going to actually get control through the purse of these agencies. And secondly, you're going to allow ordinary Americans who today are completely disaffected. They think in general regulation is good, but they know individual regulations that are harming them today. You give them some standing to go into court to challenge what's going on. Because right now they don't. And regulators at the FCC there's not really a lot of what Alan would call the rule of law. And with that, I will end.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open it for questions from you, unless there are comments from the panel that they would like to make at the last minute. But I'll take questions from the floor. Please.
Hi, I'm David Azarad with the Heritage Foundation. Harold, what's the evidence for this claim about deregulation? So there's trucking and airlines, but everyone seems to be happy with that. When you press them and you ask them,
right,
what are the bills or the actions or what's the evidence they offer?
The evidence they offer that
back up their claim that there's too much deregulation.
Go visit small town America and ask them about airline deregulation. They're not happy. Trucking deregulation, I have to say, I don't know that I've met anyone who's been unhappy with that. There might be, well, I'm not sure the Teamsters Union is entirely happy with trucking deregulation. But that's going back 40 years. But more recently, I was in Chicago yesterday, and someone was telling me how dreadful healthcare deregulation has been, as if there has been healthcare deregulation.
Well, if I can just climb on there. So I think you don't want to underestimate the amazing unpopularity of banking since the crisis, and there is actually a script for banking that can at least refer to some things that were deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s. I deal with this in my book with Steve Haber, Fragile by Design, because it's a very prominent view that that particular individual, that professor you were describing, I know has said these things. It's a misinformed view, but there was a lot of deregulation. Bank powers were deregulated in the 1990s. Bank branching limitations were deregulated in the 1980s and 1990s. And we really did create our first very large nationwide banking organizations in the 1990s. So it isn't wrong to say that there was deregulation in banking. And furthermore, it isn't stupid, it might still be wrong, but it's not stupid to make a connection between the origins of these large behemoth organizations and the financial crisis and the bailout. Now, that's too simplistic and it's not right. But I just want to emphasize the financial crisis was not a small event in the shaping of opinions about regulation and deregulation. And I think that it's wrong, but nonetheless, that is a commonly held view.
I mean, another point about this is that people usually don't see benefits. They don't thank somebody for a benefit, even if they do see it. But they certainly know when they think there's a cost.
True.
Go ahead, please.
John Samples, Cato Institute. I have a Quarry Boy question. It's a process question. Right now, Republicans have term limits on their committee chairs, and they move around every few years. Should that be done away with? Does that advance the cause of Quarry Boys? Does it weaken it, or is it just indifferent? And more generally, I'd like to toss out the question, should we be moving more toward leadership-centered House, or a committee chairman-centered House, or more individualistic for members? What sort of institutional innovations would advance the cause I think we all agree about?
My personal view is that Congress and the House in particular has emasculated itself in the past generation. It used to be there were a handful of people who had enormous amount of power, and things got done. You know, the budget actually got balanced almost every year before the Budget Reform and Impoundment Act of 1974, which diffused power.
Not true.
No one was actually in charge. And I think the seniority system has been bad for that reason as well. I think the sunshine in government, frankly, has been bad for that reason as well. Everything that you do to make it difficult for people to actually make decisions, to be grown-ups, leads to indecisiveness and lack of responsibility. And that, unfortunately, is very much my view of where Congress is today.
Tom Miller, AEI. I'd like to tease out from the panel some comments a little further deeper on the political economy of regulation. We certainly had instances in the past of kind of a second-best theory of regulation-induced innovation, where we create different ways around the old regulations, and it only took 50 or 60 years to get rid of the New Deal restrictions on banking. It took a lot of, creative activity, which may have had some efficiency costs along the way. But two other factors would be, what does this load of regulation mean in terms of barriers to entry and exit in industries? And the modern approach to legislating seems to be to write broad aspirational text with a lot of holes to be filled in later, which then allows Congress to have it both ways. They said they did it, and then they get to fix it later on or intervene selectively.
Well, let me start because it's connected to finance, I think, pretty closely. So first, the fact about entry. There is essentially no new entry into banking in the last 6 years. I think I could count on one hand the number of new chartered banks.
A lot of exit.
A lot of, not the, by exit, I think you mean consolidation of the smaller banks into, so there's some consolidation, but.
I mean the closing up of community banks.
Well, but I think that it's mainly a consolidation rather than it's not sort of a failure so much as a consolidation. Yes, you're right that there are exiting. I agree with you. But it's mainly no new entry. And also for the larger banks, I want to emphasize this. Although I made it sound like it was easy to get around regulation. Some, that's true, like capital requirement risk weights. But it's not easy to get around a lot of these regulations. And if you look at the market-to-book ratio of the large banks, where Citibank, I think, is still below half, you can see that these institutions, the value of the organizations have suffered hugely and are continuing to suffer. We're several years into this. These organizations have not found ways to get around very damaging regulations. And in the case, some of this is systemic. Once you use as the liquidity and simple leverage requirements, rather than any good risk-based system applied to the banks, what that did was it destroyed the over-the-counter bond market. Why? Because the risk associated with the inventory of bonds is very small, but if you have to maintain 7, 8, 10% of equity against holding an investment-grade corporate bond, you're going to get out of that business. And so you can't have a market because the people who are the natural dealers to do the inventory holding don't want to do it. So I want to be clear here. I don't want to lead in the people to think these regulations are easy to get around. They're not, and they have systemic consequences, and they have consumer cost consequences that are persistent. As you pointed out, it was 6 decades really to get around the branching restriction permanence. Well, that was really more like 160 years of bad ideas. So, and it had huge costs. The U.S. was the most unstable system in the world financially for over a century as a result of it. So both things are true. There are go-rounds, mainly shadow banking grows, but it really does matter that we have a horribly inefficient banking system. Sorry for the long answer, but it was too juicy.
Please.
Whit Ayers, North Star Opinion Research. The new economy has a certain self-regulatory aspect to it. Uber drivers rate riders and riders rate drivers. And the new economy is cropping up in all kinds of places like finance. To what extent does this new economy have the potential to maybe not undermine existing regulation, but bypass existing regulation?
I'll take a shot at it. A lot of new technologies begin unregulated. And I think Uber is a great example. And a lot of their advantages, they're not regulated, and the taxi industry is heavily regulated. The regulators and different levels of government are, they're not stupid. They see targets of opportunity, and so there's a big effort right now to try to regulate Uber. And the FCC, for example, is in a process of now trying to regulate much of the internet to go after companies that today are largely unregulated. So your point that new technologies begin is unregulated, but government ultimately wants to bring them under regulation.
Squash
them. They're actually not. I wouldn't say they're there to. Government regulations aren't really there to destroy companies. They just want to bring them under their influence. It's different from squashing.
I'd like to pick up on that last and talk about a conjecture which I've had. It's not a fact because I don't know that there's any evidence, but I believe it to be true. And that is, take the case of large companies in Silicon Valley. For a long time, they stayed out of Washington. They didn't want to have anything to do with the government. That's no longer true. Why? Well, one way to extract funding from them is to threaten them with regulation. And then they come in to negotiate with you. And part of that negotiation, one way or another, involves funding for your causes. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's Absolutely. Why the Communications Act was applied to the Internet. That is, it was a way of extracting from people who have a lot of money some of their money for us, for our purposes. And I believe that's related to the fact, to a second fact which has not been mentioned, and that is that many of the regulations start With the companies, it's a way in which you squeeze out or raise costs for your competitors. And that has certainly been true in banking regulation, where the large banks like regulation because regulation for the large banks gave them too big to fail. So their next largest competitors couldn't compete with them and ended up selling out to them. That's why Bank One merged with with Chase. Why JP? Why Bank of America merged with First United or whatever it was down in North Carolina. So on. They bought up their competitors who were not too big to fail, but were the next size down and couldn't compete with the lower interest rates that too big to fail gave to the leading banks.
Hi, I'm Dave Rosker, SBA Office of Advocacy. It's interesting to me that we have an advocate for an independent regulatory commission being established to head the CFPB, while next to him we have someone saying that the FCC as an independent regulatory commission is broken and is unresponsive to the bipartisan needs. So I guess my question is, what is the value of independent regulatory agencies? What makes them work? What makes them fail? Is CFPB better as an independent regulatory commission or simply responsible to the president?
I don't have the magic answer to these are hard questions, but let me just say what I liked about what I was commending about the Better Way proposal. First of all, it wants to restrict some of the powers of the CFPB. So it's not just create a commission, but actually say what things they can't do categorically. So retain power in Congress. So that the other thing is, and here they were correct as far as the circuit court opinion, that its structure was uniquely bad in that it had one person who had too much authority. So I think they were right about that too. And so they simply referred to the normal commission structure, which at least is bipartisan and diverse, doesn't concentrate too much authority in one person. So that combination of limiting authority so that Congress retains its rightful power under the Constitution and creating less of a dictatorial authority with less powers to dictate to consumers, I think that's what's attractive about it. But I don't have a strong view of whether, of how much we want to house in the CFPB and how we want to structure it. But I do want to say one thing I agree with about the CFPB. Remember, the vision, and I'll give Barney Frank credit for this too, the vision was if you're going to regulate consumer banking products, you can't just regulate banks. You have to regulate all the you have to regulate at the activity at the product level, and I think that's sensible.
So let me just say something about healthcare. We resolved that problem. we have one agency that hands out the money and also regulates, and directly reports to the president. So if you wanted to consolidate power, that's the way to do it. Now, will it be responsive to consumers? Will it be responsive to Congress? I wouldn't bet on it. But it will be responsive to the hidden flows of funds back to finance the things that any president, Republican or Democrat, wants to do.
Thank you for today. I was trained across the street from Hoover, and over at the business school, we like punch lists and we like consultative recommendations. I would politely recommend to each of you gentlemen that you have, I think Mr. Calamaris, you came closest to a punch list of specific recommendations that are achievable in your own mind beyond a better way. I've got 7 for the FCC, and they don't really incorporate budget. But David, you're at the SBA. I mean, your agency is supposed to give voice to for small businesses who lack resources and who Mr. Frick-DeBrock don't have the resources to go to DC Circuit. And that's a toothless tiger at this point. There's no benefit cost analysis required by the FCC. They may run it in the economist's office, but Mr. Wheeler and Ms. Rosenworcel would refuse to answer the question about whether they would endorse statutory benefit cost requirements.
Excuse me.
So I think benefit cost is out there. There's an ambassadorial agency charged with entering either the courtroom or the FCC to speak for small businesses and individuals. They don't do it. There's not enough teeth there. And the FCC needs to stop standing behind the public interest as the way in which regulations are promulgated. You might want to comment, each of you. Thank you.
I will say the FCC, SBA comments on just about every FCC proceeding, and in every FCC rulemaking, they attach the SBREPA, Small Business Regulatory and I forgot all Regulatory Flexibility Act. They have the statement of that. They list their number of small businesses that are affected, and they wave their hands and sort of say, you know, there's no great cost here. So they right now, the way, at least the commission, the FCC, I don't know about, I can't speak for other agencies, the way they interpret it is as SBREPA is little more than they're obligated to attach a document in their rulemaking, and they move on from there. I don't know if that's probably not how the Small Business Administration would like to see that done, but.
Certainly we prefer to see small business impacts incorporated in consideration of the rule rather than simply appended to the rule. But I don't know particular FCC rulemaking, so I can't speak to the adequacy of their compliance.
My answer to your question is very quick, which is this presentation will contain and does contain very specific recommendations on every one of the points, and it will be forthcoming in a journal article in the Journal of Financial Services Research within probably about 6 months.
And for that matter, here's my checklist.
You should hold that up again so people can see it.
Okay. Available at a bookstore near you. No. Free online. Free online.
McKinsey, boil that down to one slide with a bang box at the bottom.
The problem with this kind of an agenda, most of it doesn't have a chance.
One other point to advertise. So our group is at our next meeting. We'll be having a paper from Harold, which is going to be attempting to come to grips with this more. So we're actually sponsoring Harold to do that.
Which is actually on a more.
Let me step back. Let me step back and say, fundamentally, what we have here is a problem of what is a public good and what should be provided by the government. That is, what is the division, the proper division, between public goods supplied by the government and other things which are left to the private sector. We don't have that system anymore. That was the system we started with, but we don't have it anymore. The result of that is that you get a gap between the value of the regulation and the costs of making the regulation. And those values can be very large. A good place to see that working is what President Xi in China is trying to do. He's trying to close down the graft corruption which exists because of that gap, because the value of what is being given away in the regulation is much greater than the cost of making the regulation. And the result is that any system which creates that gap is going to create the opportunity for corruption and circumvention, which will take different forms in different ways. The Constitution, the rule of law, says the way to avoid that is to make the regulation apply to everybody in the class. We don't do that. We're very specific. And that's why regulation, the rule of law, is so important in thinking about how to get out of the morass which we and almost every other society have created. That is, you have to have, you won't avoid it completely, but you're going to get closer to the truth if you have the rule of law and you apply the principles to everybody. Why is that? Because competition, there'll be people in the group who will say, We don't want that. We like freedom. The way we do it now, we don't get that opposition. Think about health care. Health care is a wonderful example. They talk about the number of people who got health care that didn't have it before. They never talk about the number of people who stopped buying health care because the price got so high or the provisions of the health care programs didn't appeal to them or for whatever reason. That's a group. So what we did was to transfer benefits to the uninsured at some of the potentially insured. Those are costs. If we put them all together into the puzzle, those competitive forces come out. Hillary's program, single payer, which people on the left like, it can take no time for any smart economist to show that single payer is cheaper. But that's because they ignore the dynamics. The competition which we have in the system is what produces the innovations that make the system work better. We lose those. I think we had an example in what Joe said, because we've centralized the innovation into a federal agency which doesn't compete. My solution to that and many other problems is not ideal, but it may be the best we can do, and that is to reactivate the federal system so that those states that want a lot of regulation, like New York and California, can have it, and those states that don't want much regulation can have that. And we'll see the competition between the states, who comes out ahead.
I'm Elizabeth Fry. I'm from Senator Hoeven's office, and I wanted to speak kind of on what Harold was saying about the query boy mentality. From a legislative standpoint, one of the challenges I think Congress faces is the constitutionality of Congress's ability to have oversight or intervention on an agency's rulemaking process. And so I'm wondering if you can just speak a bit to that kind of delicate balancing act that Congress has to play in that.
Well, first of all, I think there's an initial constitutional issue about the delegation of regulatory authority to agencies. The Constitution is very clear that lawmaking is done by Congress, not by the executive, and not by these. I don't even know what to call these independent agencies. These kind of creations. So I think that's the first issue, that the ultimate responsibility for lawmaking, and I would say a lot of the rules that agencies make are de facto laws. They are the law of the land, and I'm not talking about the hours that the national park is going to be open from 8:30. That's fine, but when you get into very major issues such as we're going to regulate the internet, or we're going to set up privacy rules for online communication. That, to me, is something that Congress should be doing. The issue that you say about can Congress oversee this without interfering with this, this is the Orwellian state that we live in, that the people who are actually constitutionally responsible for certain aspects of our government are told by the courts and told by the administration, you're not allowed to weigh in on that. Some unelected officials who actually do not have that constitutional authority are going to object if you, Congress, assert your constitutional authority. This gets completely to the query boy mentality. I'll leave it at that.
Neil Chilson from Commissioner Olhausen's office at the Federal Trade Commission, and your question is part of the reason why I'm here today, because Hoover Institution has done a great job of studying sort of institutional structure, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about two particular commissions, the FCC and the FTC, and how they operate very differently, even though they're both bipartisan commissions. And they have very different roles. One of them's an industry-wide rulemaker. One of them is much more of a economically wide, broad jurisdiction, but case-by-case enforcer. And those two different approaches have really different outcomes. And I'm a little bit biased, perhaps, but it seems like the FTC has done its job fairly well. And we're starting to get I won't call it a natural experiment, more of an unnatural experiment of the FCC reaching into the FTC's jurisdiction, and we'll get a chance to see how that works, right? So my question for the panel is, the case-by-case versus industry-wide rulemaking, how is that operated in, I'm very familiar with it in the telecom sphere and the privacy sphere. How about in the financial sectors and healthcare sectors, and what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of those two approaches?
I'll just be brief because I know we're running out of time and let Joe talk about this. But so, and our next panel, this is a good setup for our next panel because we're going to have a lot of discussion, I hope, of guidance and those kinds of things. So, of course, guidance is the big problem because guidance is a violation inherently of the rule of law. What you do is you create a vague sort of indication. There's no comment required. There's no formal rule. And you say things that simply create a sense of your own power to then decide on a case-by-case basis with every institution what it's going to be. The Federal Reserve, probably the single most damaging thing that the Federal Reserve did in the 1990s and the 2000s was its oversight of the merger and acquisition process. And by the way, the FTC had jurisdiction, it thought, over some of this, but never really weighed in. So there was a possibility that it could have had something to say there. But the problem there was that there was a $2.4 trillion amount of money that changed hands in order to get people to come to testify at Federal Reserve Board hearings in favor of mergers. And that testimony was simply an expression of a certain political constituency's approval of these mergers, and it was a quid pro quo. You could call it extortion. I think Phil Graham has called it extortion. And so the Federal Reserve noticed that the Federal Reserve never set a rule that said, in order to be a good citizen under the Community Reinvestment Act and have your merger approved, you have to do X. Because it would never have wanted to say, you've got to pay money to a bunch of organizations and individuals. That would have been unthinkable, right? So instead what they did was they said, you've got to show that you're a good citizen. That was probably the most damaging to our society, the most damaging guidance of anything that anyone has done. So I think, I'll stop there because I could go on and on, but that's the most obvious example of where the lack of any clear rule about what it means to be a good citizen and therefore able, qua good citizen, to engage in a merger. By keeping that so vague, $2.4 trillion changed hands and created also huge instability in the mortgage market.
So in healthcare, we don't call it extortion, we call it bribery. It's actually a more effective method. So, why did the ACA come into being? Well, because there was the promise that the entire health sector would see trillions of dollars, new money, going in. And it almost didn't matter who got it, because eventually everybody going to get a piece of it. So the idea that I think that the downfall here is that by consolidating everything into one agency, there's absolutely no hope whatsoever of having any kind of conflicting opinion. Even the defection of some of the big health insurers out of the exchanges, what is that? Well, they just want a better deal. They're not complaining about the basic rules. They just want a better deal. And
they supported the basic rules.
Well, they supported the basic rules. Some parts of the health sector fought a little bit because they were annoyingly independent, but they were treated to new taxes and so on. So they've all come into line. I think, it's not a coincidence that this is the year that insurance companies and the exchanges are announcing big premium increases for 2017. Why is that? Well, we won't have Barack Obama to kick around anymore, and this sets up the negotiation next year with Hillary Clinton, because I think they were probably betting on Hillary, the negotiation with Hillary Clinton about what's our new deal going to be. So hold on to your wallets.
One final question? Is there a final question?
Hi, it's Daniel Flores from House Judiciary Committee. I took in Harold's comments earlier about some of the shortcomings that he saw in the bills. I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to some of the bills in the Better Way package out of House Judiciary that will respond to those questions. For example, in the Regulatory Accountability Act, or APA reform bill, there are provisions that make it much more robust in terms of the accumulation of an administrative record on cost benefit that can be used to counter administrative agencies in court that require judicial review, allow judicial review of those issues, and in between require that agencies, as a general matter, adopt the least cost alternative that's effective in implementing the statute based on the alternatives considered in the analysis. So there's that. There's the REINS Act that requires congressional approval of new major rules. There's the Separation of Powers Restoration Act that overturns the Chevron doctrine, which I know must be of particular concern to you. There's the Review Act, which requires basically a delay of effective dates of new billion-dollar rules for any billion-dollar rules that are timely filed in court after promulgation. And for one more, there's the Midnight Rules Relief Act introduced in July that would allow Congress to disapprove all midnight rules by one disapproval resolution under the Congressional Review Act. So I do think that there's a fair amount, in fact a considerable amount in the Better Way agenda that would evince the kind of mentality that Harold's looking for, and just urge everybody to take a closer look at some of those provisions.
Thank you, Harold. Charlie, Joe, we'll break for about 15 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll come back to this. We're off to, I think, a very interesting start on a very important issue. This panel is going to discuss constitutional law. When I think about the Constitution, as I have recently, I remember that what I learned in grade school was that our Constitution came out of the Revolution. And the Revolution was a revolution about something that was unique at its time: consumer sovereignty, public sovereignty. Lincoln expressed it very well in the end of the Gettysburg Address when he said government of the law, government by the public, by the public. What an idea. It was a novel idea. He hoped it would not perish from the earth, but it certainly has gone a long way from this country. The idea was that we elected a Congress, and the Congress made a law under the guidance of the voters. That's not where most of the law comes from. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution enshrines the idea that Congress makes all the laws. But that isn't true. Congress doesn't make most of the laws. The regulations take the place of law, and they're made by administrative agencies, and the Congress doesn't have much to say about them directly. What we have instead of government of the people, by the people, we have government by the administrative agencies and approved or disapproved by the lawyers. That's the source, especially these days, when the regulators getting into all sorts of social and moral issues have distinct disruptive effects on the stability of the society. We are a very heterogeneous society. so most unlikely to be willing to accept gracefully the idea that is imposed upon us by regulators. So it is heartening to see that Paul Ryan has stepped into that breach at the highest level of the Congress to talk about how we can reform. His reform will not be the last word. It isn't the first word, but it's a powerful word which opens for legitimate debate the question about how are we going to give back or to strengthen the role of the Congress and weaken the role of the regulators. That's what our panel, I hope, is going to address. So we're going to begin with Chris Demuth. Chris has a long experience. He was the first head of OIRA. He's written profoundly about regulation, and Michael Greavy, Elin Worman have all written papers for the Regulation and Rule of Law conferences, the papers which will be published and which will, I hope, stimulate a very active discussion in the academic community and in the Congress. Chris?
Thank you, Alan. Our topic is this paper from the Better Way project. It is titled The Constitution. It is actually about the Constitution and the administrative state. I agree that it's an admirable document in many respects. It's also a rather curious amalgam. On the one hand, it reads like an internal call to action addressed to members of the House, telling them to suit up and pull up their socks and get back in the game of budgeting and legislating and checking and balancing the other branches. But at the same time, it reads like a party platform document of the pre-Trump Republican Party, laying out a program for countering out-of-control federal spending and regulating with many provisions that have a strong partisan valence to them. It is a earnest, wonky, detailed document rather than one of broad theme or theory. It reminds one a little bit of a Mitt Romney 27-point plan for rekindling American job creation. In fact, it has 37 proposals, and most of those have numerous sub-proposals, which take the whole document certainly into the triple-digit range. Some of the proposals are, to my way of thinking, excellent. Some of them, to my way of thinking, are terrible. The other panelists, Eileen and Mike, will be focusing, I think, on the good, the bad, and the ugly from their own perspectives. I want to offer a general critique of the documents and a couple of ideas for a somewhat different approach. The best part of this document is its frank, unflinching acknowledgement that the decline of Congress as a fully functional part of the constitutional scheme is mostly a matter of self-abdication. In recent decades, and especially in recent years, we are used to complaints from members of Congress and from committees of Congress, it's sometimes angry complaints, sometimes self-pitying complaints, focusing on the seizures of legislative powers undertaken by presidents and courts, undertaking things that Congress really ought to be doing itself. There is something to that, but the main part of the story is that Congress itself has increasingly failed as a result of uninterest or inability to exercise the awesome powers that are given to it right there in Article 1 of the Constitution, and desiring more and more over time to leave a larger share of hard policy making and decision making to the President, the agencies, and the judges. For such a large part of Congress, to face the music on this score is an important development and greatly to be admired. The report's recommendations, however, are in glaring contrast to the blunt candor of the report's confessions of congressional nonfeasance. And in some respects, it's quite striking simply because of this acknowledgement that runs through the report, that in some cases the proposals are a parody of the very problems of congressional legislative decision-making that the report is criticizing. I want to focus on three problems. The first is that when it comes to describing what ought to be done within Congress itself, the proposals are highly hortatory. There's this problem that the authorizing committees have been permitting continuing appropriations for programs that aren't authorized. You know what should be done about that? The authorizing committees should cease permitting the appropriating committees to appropriate these programs. Congress is writing laws with delegations to the executive branch that are vague, aspirational, sometimes self-contradictory. The answer is that we should be drafting legislation that is specific and that faces up to the hard choices and limits this discretion of executive officers. It's been a long time. Almost nobody can remember up there when Congress actually passed a budget and 12 or so appropriations bills on time and used appropriations riders to control what was going on in the executive branch. The solution for that problem is that Congress needs to resume budgeting and appropriating, and it needs to exercise the power of the purse. And while it's at it, it has to redo the Budget Act of 1974, and the way to do that is to reinforce Congress's powers of the purse and improve its oversight of executive branch authority. It has been a third of a century since the Chadha decision took away Congress's legislative veto, but there are a lot of statutes on the books that have never been reviewed that only passed because the legislative veto was part of it, which the Supreme Court took away. But nobody's ever reviewed those to see what ought to be done instead. The solution is we need to review these and decide what should be done instead. In these respects, the report reminds me of the long ago observation of the political scientist Edward C. Banfield, that many, maybe most proposals for policy reform consist of saying that the solution to the problem of drunkenness is greater temperance in the consumption of alcohol. I'm not being completely fair here. Along with the exhortations, there are some nitty-gritty proposed ideas for procedural and rule changes, such as allowing point-of-order objections to appropriations for unauthorized programs right on the floor. But there's a striking lack of diagnosis of the source of Congress's permitting its powers to fall into disitude, and hard proposals for trying to resurrect them. Second, it reads like an omnibus bill. An omnibus bill is where Congress has decided it's going to address some problem, and it takes every member's suggestions and throws every one of them in, regardless of whether the result is a coherent approach to the problem at hand. We hear people in Congress complaining that the administrative state is filled with duplicative and conflicting obligations. But this report is filled with duplicative and conflicting obligations. The ineffective Congressional Review Act is to be replaced by the robust Serious Reins Act. Oh, but wait a minute. We're also going to reform the Congressional Review Act to strengthen it and make its procedures more robust. And also we're going to require that many very important regulations be conducted through formal rulemaking, findings of fact, more like adjudication. And then also, after the decisions are made and Congress has voted up or down on a regulation, then it goes to the courts who are going to review the rules under heightened standards of stricter standards and less deference and so forth. So that for big rules, there's going to be something like an adjudicative procedure and findings of fact, and then those findings of fact are going to be reviewed and voted up or down by Congress, and then a court is going to decide whether this congressional enactment meets the standards of the Administrative Procedure Act. I don't think all of those things are going to happen. I think that there are good and bad aspects to each one of those reform procedures, but putting them all in at once is confusing. Third, when it comes to the courts and the executive branch, the emphasis, I hate to say this, I know there are some authors of the Regulatory Accountability Act here. The emphasis is on micromanaging the other branches. That is, with a host of new procedures, of specifying what the working relationships are to be among different members of different offices within the executive branch. Many, many more requirements for more reports to Congress. Requirements, of course, for greater transparency, responsiveness, clear language, and so forth. And there's just first of all, there's a lot of beseeching of the other branches. Secondly, in its emphasis on procedures, the procedural emphasis, it seems to me to look a lot like regulatory legislation, where you don't actually make a decision. You actually say that the decisions have to be made through certain procedures, and I believe that it would be just as ineffective. And at worst, just very cumbersome. The more procedural wrinkles there are, the more the executive branch will have to actually have a menu to choose from and fit a particular decision through one way or another into one procedure or another. So I think that while it's said that this is going to clamp down on executive discretion, in a lot of cases it won't. But in a lot of cases, it just seems to be it's trying to make the executive branch just as cumbersome as the executive branch, as the legislative branch. I don't think that should be the aim. I think that I'm all for I'm an executive branch guy myself. I think I'm for energy in the executive, under clear specifications of what you get to do and what you don't in the executive branch, rather than an endless recitations of how you have to spend your day and who you have to check in with and what kind of records you have to keep and what kind of publications you have to produce. So I find it disappointing in that respect. I want to suggest my own better way, a somewhat different, and I'm going to do this. I'm probably nearly out of time, so I'm going to be very specific about this. Proposals for resurrecting the role of Congress, made by the Congress, ought to focus on the Congress. Reformers, constitutional reformers in Congress, ought to take a leaf from the executive playbook and focus on unilateral action. You got all the cards there if you look at Article 1, the appropriate sections, and there is a lot that you can do other than simply resolving to break the bad habits that you have acquired. That's where the focus ought to be, on congressional reform. The problem is congressional nonfeasance, and you've got to be specific about how you're going to change that. And you have to do it in a way that is going to get some minority participation among Democrats, among people with different policy views, if the point is to make the Congress itself an institution that has strong views about its own constitutional prerogatives. That, to some extent, has to be above partisanship. I don't know if this can be done, to tell you the truth. The reasons for congressional decline are very, very deep. They have to do with changes in our politics, in our culture, in the rise of presidential government, and the fact that close to half of any House or Senate is simply now a collaborator with the current administration. reckless of Congress's institutional prerogatives, and it could be that there is no solution within the constitutional scheme. I myself am open to that, but it hasn't really been seriously tried. And I can think of all sorts of things that could be done that would have a fair chance of attracting Democrats to a program of constitutional revival. There are a lot of little things that can be done. Rather than calling on the executive branch to prepare more reports on this and that, beef up Congress's own institutional capacities to monitor the executive branch. Prepare your own damn reports, and empower the Congressional Budget Office with a regulatory review function to second guess executive branch assessments of the costs and benefits of regulation. CBO has been a great success in constitutional competition. It has outflanked the Office of Management and Budget in affecting public debate. Make use of that. The resurrection of budgeting and appropriating is the sine qua non. If Congress cannot do that, and if even in the current constellation, Democrats are not interested in using the power of the purse to affect one or another detail of program administration, then it seems to me there's no hope for Congress. So that returning to regular appropriating, using appropriations riders the way both Republicans and Democrats did to torture me when I was an executive branch official in the Reagan administration. If they can't do that, they can't do anything. And it ought to be fairly nonpartisan. It's basically parochialism versus the grand schemes of the executive branch. The problem we have today is excessive discretion, concentration of power, and specialization, which leads to excess in the executive branch. And if we cannot inject a degree of parochialism back into that, then we should really forget about resurrecting Congress. So they should start by getting control of the budget and spending that's their constitutional responsibility. I've got lots more to say, but I think that these two gentlemen have lots more to say also. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Ellen?
Thank you. Out of respect for my panelists, I will gesticulate up here instead of over there. And it's really an honor to be a part of this panel. For those of you who don't know, Michael Grieva and Kristen Muth are legendary in this field. And for those of you who don't know me, which as I scan the room is everybody, I am somewhat less legendary in this field. But I'm nevertheless honored to be a part of this panel.
A legend in the making.
Something like that, legend in the making. So I want to begin with describing what I see as the problem of modern administrative government. So I'll start with a little bit of framing. And this problem, I think, has two major parts. The first facet of the problem is that when Congress delegates its legislative power to agencies, it's very, very hard for it to reclaim any of that authority subsequently. If agencies do something, even pursuant to completely valid delegation, it's completely valid interpretation of the statute, but Congress changes its mind or doesn't think that's a good idea, and especially when the agencies do things that are without the congressional authorization, it's very hard to reclaim any of the authority that Congress has delegated to agencies. Why? Because all it takes is the President of the United States and a mere 1/3 of either house of the United States Congress to stop Congress from doing anything. So for example, consider the Clean Power Plan or the Open Internet Order. Members of Congress didn't like it very much, and it's highly questionable whether these are valid under the existing organic statutes. So Congress enacted a resolution of disapproval in the case of the Clean Power Plan, and the president vetoed it. And I don't think it would surprise anybody that at least 1/3 of one of the two houses of Congress agreed with the president and supported the veto. So what do we have to conclude from this state of affairs? I think, and Mike McConnell actually made this point in a paper to the Hoover Institution's Regulation and Rule of Law Conference, is that the separation of powers has actually become a problem under modern administrative government. Because historically, the separation of powers was a check on illiberal government. It was a check from government doing things. Before government could do something new, it needed the assent of the House of Representatives, the assent of the United States Senate, and the president to support it. But now, the administrative state, or the president and his subordinates in the administrative state, undertake massive legislative changes at the president's say-so, and Congress is completely powerless to do it, because to undo any of that, it needs to go through all those hoops that traditionally were a check on illiberal government. So I want to wrap up this first point with a quotation from a United States senator from 1803, John Randolph. The question was, do we delegate to Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States, nearly plenary power over how to govern the Louisiana Territory that he had just purchased from the French government? And he is reported, John Randolph is reported as having said the following in the US Senate. If we give this power out of our hands, it may be irrevocable until Congress shall have made legislative provision. That is, a single branch of the government, the executive branch, with a small minority of either house, may prevent its resumption. That was in 1803. How very perceptive. But there is another problem. The other facet of this problem is that the obvious solution is for Congress to stop delegating its power, to start doing the legislating. And in fact, this has been traditionally advocated for generations by conservatives and constitutionalists, and the Speaker has a number of solutions along these lines. For example, on page 8, he proposes that Congress must draft legislation more clearly to limit executive discretion. Such legislation could include precise language detailing who a law is designed to benefit, in what way, and for what period of time. And then lower down, he writes the following. Best drafting practices could include specific and prescriptive language supporting a well-defined congressional policy so that regulations are not necessary and executive discretion is confined. I'll let that simmer for a moment, and I'll repeat that last bit. Specific and prescriptive language supporting a well-defined congressional policy so that regulations are not necessary? Well, that sounds fantastic, and I mean that in both senses of the word. It sounds both wonderful and crazy. It's preposterous. That's never going to happen. Congress delegates to agencies precisely because it's hard work to pass legislation in Congress with specific and prescriptive language. Congressmen, and Chris DeMuth alluded to this, much prefer to pass broad, goals-based statutes. We shall have clean air, or we shall not have another financial crisis, and tell agencies go forth and figure out how to make that happen. So thus we arrive at the second problem of modern public administration, that Congress does not have the political will to stop delegating to the agencies. And I shall touch more on this shortly, but neither does it have the capacity. So now let's take a step back and look at these two problems in tandem. On the one hand, we have a Congress that can't help itself. It has to delegate legislative power to agencies. But then if agencies go too far, or if Congress wishes to rein in an agency or reclaim some of its authority, it can't do anything about it. So on the front end, we have a will and capacity problem, and on the back end, we have a separation of powers problem. So it seems to me that whenever we talk about reforming the administrative state, we must keep these twin problems in mind. Every proposal must somehow navigate the Scylla of essentially irreversible delegation with the Charybdis of a lack of congressional capacity and will to end delegations. So it's with that in mind that we should ask, do the Speaker's proposals in his A Better Way agenda successfully navigate between the Scylla and Charybdis? Now, some of them do navigate these very narrow straits somewhat, but most don't. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to say that most of the proposals here aren't perfectly good ideas. Most of them are. For example, page 9, strengthen the ability of inspectors general to identify fraud. Great. No one can complain. Page 10, incentivize the preserving of records in electronic format. Also good. Page 13, require agencies to write regulations in clear, plain language and publish them online. Also awesome. I'm somewhat skeptical of Congress's ability to get agencies to, or lawyers, us lawyers, to write like that. But great, if you can somehow legislate that, sure. On page 14, I find this kind of funny. Reform the Congressional Review Act to ensure agencies are submitting the rules to Congress. This one's somewhat humorous because the Congressional Review Act already requires agencies to do just that. It just turns out, we had some entrepreneur go take a look at this problem, and agencies just don't always do that. They just don't send their regulations to Congress as they're supposed to. So I'm all for making agencies meet their existing reporting obligations to Congress. So as far as these proposals, they're good proposals, and I certainly do not mean to disparage them or denigrate them in any way. But my broader point is that they don't reform very much. They don't get us very far. And we finally get to the crux of the problem and the bigger reforms that the Speaker discusses. His reforms don't really successfully navigate those two problems that I've described. So on page 15, the Speaker proposes to compensate for Congress's loss of the traditional legislative veto with new means of checking and balancing agency overreach. Now, this is very, very, very important. The legislative veto historically was a very powerful tool in the hands of Congress. Basically, an agency could do whatever it wanted pursuant to the ostensible congressional authorization, but if Congress didn't like what the agencies did, Congress could step in and said, agencies, we don't like that. We veto it, and it stopped it from happening. You didn't need the president's signature. So this gets around our separation of powers problem. It gets around the skilla. It also gets around our Charybdis, because Congress doesn't take that much will or capacity to occasionally focus on a particular regulation when there's particular incentive to do so, and to veto it and to take action, right? The alternative is to look at hundreds and hundreds of regulations. Much more capacity is required, not for a legislative veto. Well, unfortunately, and as we all know, the legislative veto was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1983 on the theory that Congress, when it acts, can only act through bicameralism and presentment. You need both houses of Congress acting at the same time, and also the president's assent. So what are the Speaker's proposals for compensating for the loss of legislative veto? So he says, first, the authorization and appropriation committees should coordinate more closely to block funding for implementations of improper administrative activity. That all sounds great. But this doesn't get around our separation of powers problem. Now, the president isn't going to veto all of these defundings, but remember, when it comes to the budget or the budget process, you still need the president's signature to get something done. So in theory, this doesn't get us around our separation of powers problem. So then the Speaker proposes to enact the REINS Act. This somehow is a favorite topic of discussion. For the uninitiated, the REINS Act would require agencies to send rules to Congress, and if Congress doesn't approve them, they don't take effect. So you need congressional action each time before a rule actually takes effect. Consider that in light of the legislative veto, right? The inertia is completely reversed. With the legislative veto, agencies do things that have the effect and force of law, and only if Congress chooses to interfere or intervene can the agency action be undone. The REINS Act, on the other hand, would require Congress to take action in every single case. So the problem here is not with Scylla, but rather with Charybdis. Does the United States Congress really want the responsibility for voting on hundreds of major and controversial rulemakings every year? Again, that's not to say this is a bad idea, if the Speaker can find the support for it in both chambers and a president willing to sign it. This is really a first best world for conservatives and constitutionalists. I'm merely skeptical that Congress has the will to do it. But let us suppose that Congress does have the will to do it. Does Congress have the capacity to understand the hundreds of regulations, often technical and complex, that would come before it? It's no secret that Congress is seriously understaffed and that its staff is seriously underpaid. So a good place to start would be to look in the pages of National Affairs, and I think Krista Muth has done some work in this area, and he alluded to this earlier, where last month two authors proposed the creation of a Congressional Regulation Office, like CBO or CRS, dedicated to Congress, responsive to Congress, allowing them to analyze. I don't know exactly how it would be structured, but the point is you would load it with staff, and it would serve Congress only, and Congress would then get more capacity to understand these technical and complex regulations. If such an agency were created, legislative agency, were created as part of the REINS Act, I think that might actually get us somewhere. But the problem is, so the overall point that I want to make is that congressional reforms have to address both our front-end capacity and will problem, as well as the back-end separation of powers problem. The REINS Act would take care of the back end, right? It would take care of the separation of powers problem, but it would do nothing about the capacity or the will problem. And the appropriations approach to block funding certainly doesn't raise any front-end capacity problems. It's very easy to do that. But surely it raises separation of powers problem because the president still wields the veto pen. So you need solutions that address both. Okay, I've come to the end, so I will finish with a brief plug for some work that I've done in this area for this conference at the Hoover Institution, in a paper that I presented here 2 or 3 months ago this past summer, and that's forthcoming in the Stanford Law Review in February of next year. I suggest that conservatives should think more creatively about the separation of powers. My argument is that conservatives should embrace the delegation of legislative power. Sounds counterintuitive, but it actually might work. The idea here is for our constitutional doctrine to stop pretending that when agencies are making rules, like the Clean Power Plan or the Open Internet Orders, that they're merely executing the law. Right? The problem is if agencies are merely executing the law, the only way for Congress to change it is it has to enact a new law, going through all those separation of powers steps. But if our doctrine honestly and openly recognized what is already a fact, that Congress in fact delegates legislative power to agencies, and that when agencies make rules, they are making law, well then if Congress is understood and recognized to be delegating its legislative power, then it can reserve for itself a portion of that power in the form of a legislative veto. So there's a lot more to say on that, and I'm happy to take questions. Also, the speaker says a lot on the Chevron doctrine on page 12, and I'm happy to talk about that too, which is also near and dear to administrative law scholars' heart. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ilan. All right, our next speaker is Michael Greeby.
I'm going to echo some previous themes, but I'm a little more skeptical of this document than previous speakers. I think this document embraces the Constitution in the same way in which the party has endorsed Donald Trump. Diffidently, desperately, opportunistically. I'll give you examples of each. I think the Constitution deserves better. I mean, it's not perfect, but in 230 years, it's never groped anybody. I understand that this is a party document, not a con law seminar, and I'm not opposed to some of the more modest proposals here, improved data collection and all the rest. But I think if you're seriously proposing to reestablish constitutional government as opposed to just larding up a partisan agenda with constitutional platitudes, you have to think seriously. And that means first, you have to take the Constitution seriously. Second, you have to think long-term. Third, you have to think about incentives. And fourth, you have to think structurally and institutionally, not just situationally. The founders thought that way. This document, I think, does not come close in any dimension, and I'll give you a few examples on each count. Here's the Constitution. So here's the a better way or a better way proposal. Enact a judicial procedure permitting the House, the Senate, or both chambers together to receive expedited review by the Supreme Court of a lawsuit against the executive branch for failure to execute the law. The legislation should instruct that, and I quote, courts set aside their own court-created standing rules in cases brought by Congress, thereby preventing courts from using procedural excuses to avoid making decisions in these important separation of powers cases. I miss Nino Scalia as much as the next person, but this is a very bad way of trying to make him rise from the grave. He explained all of this in his opinion in Windsor. That's the gay marriage case. And he denounced precisely this proposal as blazingly unconstitutional. Standing is not a procedural excuse. It's a constitutional Article 3 requirement, which even Congress cannot abrogate. And standing to compel executive enforcement is a blatant violation of Article 2 and the Take Care Clause, and legislative aggrandizement of a sort that I think has been held unconstitutional in every separation of powers case I can think of going back to the 1920s. The Constitution presumes that every branch will make its own constitutional judgments and preserve its own prerogatives with its own means, and so clamoring for judicial bailout is the counsel of despair. Long term, it's sometimes said that constitutional rules should be made behind a veil of ignorance. That's an awful lot to ask. But I think even a party platform should ask, well, would we still be in favor of this if the political fronts were reversed? And this document abounds with proposals that flunk that minimal test, right? So congressional lawsuits to compel enforcement is one of them. I mean, in my book, Call Me Libertarian, I think half the U.S. code should go unenforced. And a Republican president, if we ever get one, should see to that. Compel enforcement of every last piece of Dodd-Frank, compel enforcement of every last piece of the Affordable Care Act? I don't think so. There are more examples of that, but I'll skip them. Incentives. The framers thought in terms of institutional incentives, checks and balances, and all that. Proposal after proposal here. This document urges lawmakers to do what existing rules already require, as if mere exhortation could trump legislators' manifest incentives to do the opposite or nothing at all. Chris talked about that a little, and so I'll skip that too. I want to say a little bit about the lack of realism that pervades the document's administrative law reforms here. So proposals to further formalize rulemaking, additional procedural constraints, improved requirements, and all the rest of it. Henry Waxman, John Dingell, they didn't need any of these contrivances. They just exercised institutional power. What this does is the opposite, which is to try to control things that by their nature are not subject to legal controls and cannot be controlled by law. So take the example of financial settlements between agencies and regulated industries. So there's a proposal here to prohibit third-party payments in such settlements, and it wants the payments actually to go to the Treasury as already provided for by law. I'm on board with that. But the fact is, it's the proceedings themselves here that are the problem. The agencies have incentives to bring these garbage allegations, and the targets have incentives to settle them. And because the settlement value is the product of the demanded amount and the likelihood of conviction, the phoniest allegations come along with the highest payment demands. So take the $14 billion that they want from the Deutsche Bank. They don't even bother to explain what the bank is supposed to have done wrong. And at the end, both the agency and the enforcement target have powerful incentives to settle on terms that are favorable to them, not the Treasury. So maybe you can sort of supervise or prohibit this or that contract term, but at the end of the day, you can't prevent the bargains. They'll just be repriced on some other margin. And the same logic applies to proposals to further formalize the rulemaking process and to enact the REINS Act. Elon talked about that. It seems to me, note that lots of agencies no longer proceed by rulemaking at all. They proceed either by adjudication or by proposal, right? Because regulated industries have to plan and invest in the shadow of any proposed rule, and so as a result, the agency gets what it wants by merely proposing a rule. The EPA does not care whether the Supreme Court upholds or guns down the Clean Power Plan. It's already gotten most of what it wanted, and if they don't care about judicial review, why should they care about congressional review? Once you've armed these agencies to the teeth, they'll misbehave. And so what this proposes is an improved weapons inspection system, and I don't think that's enough. Structure and incentives. As Chris mentioned, this document is very candid in acknowledging there's a problem of application, but it never quite comes to grips with why has that happened. That's a long story, but here's a piece of it. To quote a famous law review article, we no longer have a separation of powers. We have a separation of parties. The president's party in Congress will protect the executive no matter what. And in that scenario, all power flows to the executive eventually. And figuring out that problem and fixing that problem will require one of two things. Either you sort of reconnect the incentives of legislators on both sides to act in the interests of the institution and take those interests seriously, or else you adjust the institutional arrangements, especially including the arrangements to check the executive to the realities of party government. Take one example of this. Under the German Constitution, 1/3 of the legislature can ask for immediate constitutional review of any piece of legislation. Why? Because Germany doesn't have a separation of powers where one political branch checks and controls the other. And so abstract judicial review, as they call it, is a means of minority protection. And maybe under conditions of party government, we need that too. And maybe because it's a federal system, you want to extend the same thing, the same right of review, to maybe 1/4 plus one of the states. But if you want to go down that road, you have to be candid. You're a million miles outside Marbury versus Madison. You'd probably have to amend Article 3 if that's what you wanted to do. If you want to bite off even more, here's another example of the structural things that I have in mind. This proposal trumpets the Administrative Procedure Act, which is now long in the tooth as that was a rule of law document. I don't think so. I think if you want the rule of law, you may need a whole new APA. So, for example, there's been a lot of agitation about ALJs and hearing examiners inside agencies at the SEC and the CFPB, and you get them you get this inside the agency review, and then the appeal is to the agency head or the commission itself. How about creating a really, really big administrative judiciary with a Supreme Administrative Court outside the agencies, but they hear any and all appeals from any and all agencies in adjudication, and then you get an appeal to the Supreme Administrative Court. I think over time that institution would build up prestige and power. Institutional actors who can't maximize anything else do that. It would try to compete with the actual Supreme Court, which would be a very good idea. So if you need sort of some bloviate about the dignity of life, you go to the Supreme Court. If you actually have to sort of get a dispute decided, you go to the Administrative Court. I didn't make this up. This was the Prussian court system in 1890, and it is still the administrative judiciary in France. What this is saying is, congratulations, the administrative state has won. Get used to it, and let's secure as much lawfulness as we can under conditions of party government. Let me be very clear. I'm not wedded to these ideas. I'm not even advocating them. I just suggest, if somebody has a better idea to reapproximate the separation of powers that we once had, I'm all ears. Likewise with other, perhaps more productive proposals to respond to the realities of party government. But I want to say this. You cannot be as short-sighted and opportunistic as this document is. You have to believe that you get to live and fight another day. And on that theory, you should just engage sort of broader, structural, long-term, incentive-compatible proposals.
Thank you. Listening to this panel, before we open it to questions, I want to raise a question with them. One of the things that has not been mentioned, but which must be part of any forward motion, is that there's a large number of disaffected citizens who don't like the way their government is operating and who believe that for one reason or another, they are left out of the mix. They don't have any power or influence over the rules under which they are forced to live. Change was, in this miserable campaign, was certainly basic to what both parties were talking about. Who was the agent of change? What kind of change will the public want? I don't have the slightest idea about what the answer to that question is, but I do believe that it will be important in bringing us to a resolution to this problem. What the Speaker has done is open the question. He hasn't obviously settled the question, but he's opened the question. And that's an important first step because it puts it high up on the agenda of the public discussion. And the public's views on demanding change are going to enter into that from the political side. And that what will come out Maybe better or worse than what we have, but it will be different. I ask that as a question to the panel.
So I think this raises an interesting question of institutional arrangement. So there's an unfortunate tendency for these conferences to have a lot of conservatives, but no liberals or Democrats from the other side. And I think that's a shame, because really when we're talking about the Constitution and the administrative state, we should talk about institutional arrangements. And these arrangements don't necessarily have, or they don't have to have a political valence of one kind or another. So, for example, the legislative veto can be wielded equally by a Democratic Congress that doesn't like the Reagan administration's bubble policy that was involved in Chevron, and it can be used by a conservative House, right? This raises the issue of executing the law that Professor Grieva raised a moment ago. This is actually one of the great, possibly unanswered questions in constitutional interpretation, is does the president have the duty to execute a law enacted by Congress that he believes or she believes is unconstitutional? Because there are twin considerations here. Obviously, the Supremacy Clause in Marbury v. Madison says a law that violates the Constitution is no law at all. But on the other hand, the president has the veto power, and it's a suspensive veto power, not an absolute veto power. So consider the statute that was just enacted. I'm blanking on the acronym, JASTA, or the Saudi Arabia JASTA. So the president vetoed. His veto is suspensive. Congress overrode his veto. Can the president, it is now the law, Congress has decided that it's constitutional. Now, it turns out Congress wasn't thinking necessarily straight, but in theory, if things are working properly, Congress has made that decision. And now can the president just not enforce that law because he thinks it's unconstitutional? That would transform his suspensive veto into an absolute one. So in terms of, I actually like the speaker's proposal that he says we should have the executive enforce every law. I don't think there's a clear answer to this question, but I think the suspensive to absolute veto argument is important, is an important one. And this also raises Chevron, which was mentioned in a question earlier and hasn't been mentioned here in the panel. Remember the genesis of Chevron. It arose when the Reagan administration made a somewhat conservative policy decision interpreting the Clean Air Act. Now, the courts had historically decided the law for themselves and decided that the laws required more liberal outcomes than the laws ostensibly really seemed to require. So the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to defer to agencies in that case. So the point is these institutional mechanisms, a legislative veto, the president's power to enforce or not enforce the law, and judicial deference don't have to have a political valence. And we have to be very, very, very careful when we talk about how we want to manipulate or change those to affect conservative outcomes. Because I don't think we should be interested in conservative outcomes. We should be interested in institutional and constitutional outcomes. Finally, just I know I've gone on too long here, but more specifically to Alan's question, I think the answer there is another institutional arrangement, which is federalism. It's very, very hard for people to feel like they have a say in government when there are only 435 congressmen, representatives, each representing about 1 million people, 850,000, I don't know exactly what the number is now. Well, why don't we give every state legislature 435 assemblymen and just devolve power back to the states? I think that would be an institutional arrangement that would go a long way to resolving that problem.
Yes, I'm all in favor of federalism. I think the court should go back to the 10th Amendment and decide that that was what the Constitution actually said, rather than how they've interpreted it. Any other comments? Yes, go ahead.
As to individual, the disaffection of individuals with government, I believe that reforms such as the one that Mike mentioned are a beginning. An important violation of the traditional rule of law is that there are now innumerable individual disputes where people have been rolled over by the bureaucracy, where people have no recourse except to appeal to the person in the office right next to the person that just rolled over them, where you lose. Cases such as this, where you couldn't even get into the next office, have come to the Supreme Court twice in the past couple of years. In both cases, a unanimous decision holding that at least you get a hearing. That suggests a certain amount of bipartisan interest into this. I would have very clean, simple structural changes to the Administrative Procedure Act. I would have something approximating what Mike proposed, that all administrative law judges should be from a specialized agency, having specialized courts that are not part of the EPA or the FDA or any of the others, and they ride circuit among the different agencies, and they are generalists that are not beholden to any particular program. I would go further. I think that it ought to be a continuing principle of our law that anyone with a gripe against the government gets to go in and tell an Article III independent court about that gripe and get the matter adjudicated. So I think that that would go a certain way, a certain degree of the way to ameliorating the current angst and unhappiness with government. But I think that looking at the current political situation, the current campaign, I think a lot of unhappiness with the government requires some interpretation by people like us. My interpretation is that people are very unhappy with the concentration of power in Washington, with the corruption that that brings, with the fact that the government can now penetrate any nook and cranny of anybody's life and introduce coercion into all of our lives at any point it chooses, and that the results of government programs are so consistently crummy. So I think that the ultimate problems that people are worried about are the problems we're talking about here. But I think if we step forward with our platform or the Paul Ryan platform, people would be yawning, and people wouldn't really care or understand it. But problems of abuse, concentration of power, excessive government ambition and coercion, and consistently bad policy results, they tend to produce particular scandals. They tend to produce particular problems. If you asked people that are experts in financial markets or the healthcare system, as bad as things are now, they could get worse in the future. One has to be opportunistic. One saves up a series of reforms, and when the issue becomes corruption or huge dislocations in public finance, a crisis of one kind or another, when practical people, including practical people in Congress, are looking around for what to do about it, you have to say, you didn't realize this, but this is actually the solution. So there's a sense to which, in which people such as ourselves who work in Congress or the executive branch, we actually do have a deeper understanding than a lot of people do about the ultimate source of the angst we have. I don't think we can convince people to change their minds and kind of come along with our program right now. But there will be occasions, unfortunately, there'll probably be very unhappy occasions, which will provide the opportunities for doing more bad things, but also unusual chances to move things back in the right direction.
Okay, the floor is open. Let me just say in response to this, within the last 2 months or so, at least a half a dozen people who came to this country in the 50s or the 60s have said to me in almost the same words, this is not the same America I came to. That's a widespread feeling that things have changed in an unfortunate direction. Feelings of that kind, disaffection from the government, are powerful forces. They don't necessarily focus on the Ryan program or any specific program, but they want to see change. That's a powerful force, and powerful forces tend to attract leaders who try to lead them. Questions?
Very good.
Yes.
Tom Miller, AEI. It's pretty clear from the panelists. It's pretty clear for the panelists that there are no absolute solutions. That's the easy kill. And so we're talking about, matters of degree to improve things somewhat. And I appreciate Mike's implication that you can't make decision-making behind the veil of ignorance when many of the members are already operating behind a burqa of constitutional ignorance. But let's try an adaptation of a couple of other aspects of administrative law. Would there be a way to define an intelligible principle up rather than downward, in light of where we've been on that case law recently and where we're going, say, in the health sphere with IPAB? And also, what about a theory of the unitary legislator rather than a unitary executive as a different way to have a stronger congressional voice?
I'm not sure I understand it. What's a unitary legislator?
Probably you've been calling out for
Legislature.
legislature. The problem with bicameral is a little bit of a problem. You have to have some type of institutional capacity where the Congress as a institution as a whole has some type of unified stance in asserting its rights against the executive in the language that was invented by several Republican presidents to say you can't pick off a part of the executive branch without going through me.
Well, I will say, this may be what you have in mind. I am all for changes that nudge legislator members in the direction of making collective choices rather than acting as solo practitioners. They've come to see themselves as people who are in Washington to either support or oppose whatever the executive branch is doing this week, and to represent narrow interest groups or broad ideological groups in fighting with the executive on an individual basis. I'd like them to have to do less of that and more of the hard and difficult business of choice, compromise, deliberation. It's very hard these days. The mechanisms of surveillance, that every member is watched from breakfast until dinner time, every move. You know, it's amazing how much the interest groups know about what each person does. But I'd like to take some of the sunshine off of Congress. I'd like to let them deliberate in private. Most of all, I'd like to restore a degree of hierarchy. Part of the decline of the seniority system was that the seniors were Dixiecrats who were in eclipse, discredited after the Civil Rights Revolution. Nobody even remembers that except me anymore. So I mean, having a more hierarchical, strong, authorizing committees with somewhat autocratic, maybe not tenured, but for the time being strong committee chairman, I think that would be highly desirable. I have a view that all Republicans on the Hill hate, which is that we need to get far away from the current Senate filibuster and hold. I would like to force the Senate to become a majority rule institution in place of every member gets to rule essentially as it is today. And I understand the trade-offs, but the big growth of government now is executive government. The legislature cannot be in the act as long as we have the current modern configuration, which means that the Senate is a super majority institution on all routine pieces of legislation. So I think that there are a lot of things, and there are some things in this report that kind of move people towards, you call it the unitary, you could also say you have to act as a collectivity, which is very difficult, but if we can actually figure out how to do that, we really are the most, acting as a unitary body, we are the most powerful group in town, and so there are a lot of benefits for it at the end of the road.
Just on the a unitary legislature, the Senate filibuster and getting rid of the hold obviously would be very, very important, as Professor Christomuth said, to get the Senate and the House acting more constantly with one another. But it still wouldn't be unitary in the sense that the president is unitary, that the president no longer needs the action of the other branches in order to do whatever he wants or she wants to do. And the closest thing to that would be a legislative veto, some way to resurrect it. And this, I think, ties into the intelligible principle question you had, which I actually think it's much more likely for the court, the Supreme Court, to revisit the INS v. Chadha decision, striking down the legislative veto, than it is to give teeth to the intelligible principle doctrine. Because at least the way courts do things now, there is no way that it will give teeth to the intelligible principle doctrine, just because the precedent under which it is upheld broad, extremely broad delegations of authority, there is no way you would be able to reconcile those precedents with a non-toothless intelligible principle doctrine, which has existed for 100+ years. INS v. Chadha is relatively new. It's 30 years old, 33 years old, and it has never really been a settled question, I don't think, or less settled, I should say. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
Appropriations riders come close.
I'm troubled by the fact that what you call the unitary presidency and the breakdown or ending of checks and balances, which James Madison, I remind you, thought was the safeguard against tyranny, most important safeguard against tyranny in the Constitution, that begins to smell an awful lot like dictatorship. Now, there are checks against that. I mean, the Supreme Court did finally, in response to the Immigration Act, when the president told the Congress, sue me, and they did. So far, we haven't seen the end of that. So far, the court has held they could. So one step in the direction of strengthening the Congress is to do something about standing. That is, to give them more standing to sue. I'm not sure whether that would produce better government or chaos, but it would certainly produce change.
By the way, James Madison did say that the centralization of the three separate powers in single bodies is the very definition of tyranny. He says that in the Federalist. But this also raises an interesting question of what we mean by unitary. The president, under the Constitution, is unitary and should be unitary, but it's a vertical kind of unitariness. It means that all the subordinates in the executive branch, all the way down to the lowest customs officials, are answerable to the president and removable by the president. This is vertical integration. There was some dispute about this in the 1820s and 30s, and they called Andrew Jackson King Andrew Jackson because he insisted on a vertical unitary executive. But he was right, and the Constitution requires that. But what we're seeing now is a horizontal unitariness, where the executive is unitary in the sense that it has legislative, executive, and judicial power, which is very, very different.
Can I say just something in addition? I believe we don't need Democrats in the room because it would be useful if we could get over our schizophrenia on any number of issues. So we used to be against judicial supremacy, okay? Marbury versus Madison, cases in controversy, then standing barriers that mean something so that only injured individuals can get into court and all these ideologues stay out. Now all of a sudden we're on the opposite side of that and we haven't figured it out. And by the same token, we used to be in favor of presidential control over agencies, right? The president controls them, the president, and has to be unitary, and everything has to run into the White House and OIRA and OMB and all the rest of it. Now all of a sudden I see more and more sort of academic articles, but also contributions to the sort of punditocracy. Independent agencies that are made up of multi-members and are bipartisan, and wouldn't that be a great idea? And so that at least is a check on presidential control. Which is it going to be? And there are endless numbers of these questions. I mean, we're now once upon a time we were in favor of Chevron deference. Now we're supposed to be against it. We will have an Obama-Clinton administration from here to eternity, and any Republican president who will ever come into office will need all the deference in the world. Are we then supposed to switch our allegiances and our opinions again? I mean, I'm the only principled guy, right? I'm against judicial deference if it's my judges, and I'm for judicial deference if it's theirs, and that's all there is to it. But if you want to have a somewhat more principled position and long-term position, you have to figure this out. And I think in this entire debate, there's just a lot of conservative ambivalence and indecisiveness, and some of the, oh yeah, let's put that into, that accounts for some of the, what Chris called the duplication in a better way, I think.
I would like to respond by saying that I am very gratified that in our program, the papers that have been written for regulation and the rule of law include people who are convinced Democrats and come from active democratic families. That is, the Constitution is something which Democrats also, at least some, would like to maintain. And I'm pleased that they work with us or we work with them.
Joe Kyle with the Congressional Budget Office. So this is a more, I think it's probably to Chris, but anybody should jump in. And it's a bit more in the weeds than the lofty conversation of the last question. Chris, you talked about empowering Congress with more of a regulatory review role. And I'm curious to have you talk a little bit about how you would see that implemented. Would it be a stronger notion of a deeper review under the Congressional Review Act, a recreation of, not a recreation, but a creation of an OIRA-like function within the legislative branch, or something along some of the conversation in the discussion in a better way is about regulatory budgeting, and if so, just how that would be implemented. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
I think that benefit cost analysis of individual regulations is an important tool, and it is something that one can get liberals and progressives to agree to, along with conservatives, because of the capaciousness of the idea. I would like a narrower test, but I think that it is not bad. I'm impressed that presidents of both parties have been in favor of it. I'm impressed that it has passed the House and the Senate on one occasion or another. So it is something that is doable. It has become terribly corrupted within the executive branch. It's now basically a public relations tool for proclaiming the enormous benefits that Washington is going to provide to a benighted public. And my answer to it is to get some independent people thinking about the benefits and costs of regulations. So I would like it to be judicially reviewable. And I would like the Congress to get into the act. I don't have a fully formed program. I have some of the deficiencies that I see in this report because I can see several possibilities, and my answer is I would like to move in, take some small steps. I'm very worried about the REINS Act. I think that it could lead to an enormous fortification of executive power. It means that the executive gets to commandeer the congressional schedule dozens of times a year at a time of the president's choice. I can imagine it becoming routine so that more and more of the Code of Federal Regulations is essentially moved over to the United States Code. So I think that there are difficulties with it, but I'd like to tiptoe in that direction. I would like to. I can see the benefits from base closing and trade liberalization procedures where you give some initiative to the executive branch. So I could see either through mutual agreement or through statute having some congressional review. I would like to see the Congressional Budget Office develop a function whose integration with legislating I'm not prepared to specify in detail, but OIRA has become quite toothless, just as the Office of Management and Budget is much less effective as it used to actually put together budgets. The budget is it's just a partisan document now. CBO's prestige is precisely that it has preserved a degree of bipartisanship and integrity in the work that it does. So I see it's preparing benefit cost analysis, its own assessments, independent of the executive branch, whether as a contribution to debate the way its annual assessments of the long-term budget outlook do, or as a input to the Congressional Review Act, or some kind of a partial tiptoe towards REINS. I think that would be I think that would be very useful. The point I want to make is, if you're trying to get Congress back in the act and you're in Congress, focus on things Congress can do by itself. And beefing up the Congressional Budget Office was something it did it by legislation. It was the Congressional Review Act, but there is a lot that could be done, and it would not be a statute that would be vetoed to give it a bigger sway. I would like to have detailed empirical assessments of what actual and proposed regulations are doing and how much they're costing. I would like to have sources of authority that are beyond those of the executive branch that is writing the rules.
John Samples at Cato. I take it as one central conservative idea that there's no substitute for character. And indeed, when you go down these paths a little bit, as we have today on congressional reform and reviving Congress, you pretty quickly come upon the idea that, Congress actually, the congressmen act like their institution is not much. They don't have a great deal of self-respect as congressmen. And you really need what I think of is a revival of a strong sense of the congressional role in the separation of powers, balancing of powers system. The problem is how to get that. Are we saying today that some of these institutional changes might bring that, or are there other baby steps you can take toward that kind of really cultural change? And second, it seems to me could be an issue there, which is if you do somehow pull that off and had a stronger sense of the congressional role, it would spread to other areas beyond the domestic. It would spread to the war powers, for example. And if it spread to the war powers, it would actually, over the next few years, it would split the opposition that is more likely to look upon Congress favorably in the next, God knows how long, 10 years or so. And so you've got this problem of the right wanting both a stronger Congress and but worrying about it in some areas. So I just the sheer difficulty of this, I understand, and it's an abstraction, but it does seem to be there's no substitute for congressional character, or am I wrong?
Well, I very briefly, I agree strongly with that. Congress, we talk about Congress in anthropomorphic terms. There's it. Congress has it's not a purposive institution. It's a representative institution, and it reflects our society, and it has huge collective action problems. So it's really, really easy to lambast. We've done a lot of it here today. I think that we need to pay them, and it's lost a lot of its pizzazz, I think, for the general public. Geographic districts, I mean, do you really care if somebody's representing Bethesda or San Antonio? It doesn't, in a highly mobile society, it doesn't mean as much as it used to. I think that a lot of attention has to be devoted to emphasizing and celebrating the particular functions that a representative legislature can play. Make it an attractive career, make it a career where if you knew a lot about infrastructure or health care, you could actually, Tom Coburn could actually spend his life there because he has a lot of knowledge in particular areas. The executive branch specializes through hierarchy. And if you changed the composition of Congress in that way, I can think of it's becoming more attractive to a larger subset of people, and I think that those of us who are always talking about how hapless and helpless Congress is have to buck it up too and emphasize the importance of its function, both not just as a counterbalance to the other powers, but the integrity of legislating, of making compromises with people we disagree with. And coming up with laws that we can all live with. This needs to be lionized a lot more than it is.
Can I just
go ahead?
Just one addition. I strongly agree with it too. I just want to highlight one additional problem. It's obvious to me. There's a wonderful passage in Federalist 14 where sort of Madison deals with the objection of people who say, but Congress, all these powers, that'll be terrible. They'll, go completely berserk and, run roughshod over all the people. And Madison's response is, no. These people will come from big districts, and they'll be the best people we have in the country. And all the preoccupations of international commerce and war will be sufficient business for them. They won't want to be bothered with local stuff, right? Like gender-neutral bathrooms, student dating behavior, right? So that prediction turned out to be totally ludicrous. It is really ludicrous now. It's a demand-side problem. A Congress that has to put up with demands for really local, picayune, quotidian things cannot work at all. It has to, as Chris has explained on many occasions, it has to delegate, powers to outfits. It can't make decisions. It will always look bumbling. And I think that is a problem in particular going forward, because we will soon have to tell the American people, sorry, you can't have it. There's $20 trillion in debt. You cannot have it. And nobody is willing to say that at this point. And it's not just a zero-sum game going forward. It's a negative-sum game. And Congress is really, really bad at that. So I take your point. I'm completely in agreement with it. I'm just highlighting the difficulty.
It isn't just the 20 trillion, it's the 110 trillion of unfunded liabilities that are going to bring the system to a screeching halt. Charlie?
I'm thinking about our collaborator who couldn't be with us today, Mike McConnell. And one of the things, when Mike wrote an essay on this question that is occupying the panel, which is, by the way, on our website at the program on the regulation and the rule of law, he dealt with some of the questions that you've been dealing with, but he had one other one that no one has mentioned, which is the investigative and oversight role of Congress. And one of the things that Mike pointed out was that Congress used to maintain a jail in the basement, which it no longer maintains, which he sees as symbolic of a certain ceding of an important role there as an investigator and being able to enforce its subpoenas and other such things in ways that don't necessarily require this dependency currently on the executive. And so I just want to recommend his discussions on that topic. He also had some really creative ideas about middle grounds between the current filibuster and getting rid of the filibuster altogether. Right. So I think that it was a very interesting, creative set of points. And I thought that, to me, the thing that was so interesting about it was that it seems like this is very fertile ground for imaginative legal scholars to be thinking up things like that. Until you read the papers that all of you have written and that Mike's written, people from the outside don't really have a sense of how much possibility there is out there.
I like the McConnell proposals very much. Filibuster reform is going to take many, many steps. It will be an incremental process. He's got some good ones. I really like the idea of the jail. It fits exactly with my criticisms of this document, which has all these elaborate procedures, and we're directly working with the U.S. attorneys and all this kind of stuff. Do it yourself.
Lock her up.
And see what happens. I'm old enough to remember when the term contempt of Congress sent chills up and down everybody's spine in Washington. Because if they actually got around to something, it would really hurt. And contempt of Congress, it's just a way of life in the executive branch. Part of it is that it does not take enforcement of contempt seriously, but partially it's not doing anything to control the discretion of the individuals on a day-to-day basis. It used when I, in my back. When I was in the executive branch, if John Dingell took a really sharp interest in something you were doing, you didn't just blow him off. It wouldn't have occurred to anybody. And it could have gotten as bad as contempt really fast. He had a lot of nasty people working for him, but he also knew the appropriations process well. Now, I was against it, but you know, there was a flywheel in the system, and we had to not just pay attention to our own beautiful ideas, but to those of some other people. And I've got to say, in this long-run world I'm trying to fit myself into, that Grieva wants me to accommodate to, I think that was a better system, including when the shoe was on the other foot.
I will dissent in part from what has been suggested in terms of the jail. I also think it's a very neat idea, or at least a cute idea. But we have to keep in mind how actually historically it was used. So the first time someone was held in contempt of Congress and the sergeant of arms went and arrested this person, it was a private citizen who was attempting to bribe members of Congress in land speculation deals out in the West. And it's one thing to send the sergeant of arms to arrest a private citizen bribing members of Congress. It's another thing to get the sergeant of arms to go and arrest an executive officer of the government, right? To arrest Eric Holder for refusing to divulge information, or arrest Hillary Clinton for contempt of court, or arrest Lois Lerner. I just cannot imagine the sergeant of arms making a good fight against the Secret Service or the State Department security detail. I just don't see it happening. And a lot of times, the executive officers also invoke executive privilege. There's a proposal in A Better Way on this, saying somehow to revoke executive privilege. I do not see how that's constitutional. There are a couple constitutionally questionable ideas in here, and so those should be scrubbed, and I think this might be one of them.
Elon, I really liked your distinction between will and capacity, and to think of it that way. One way in which they lack capacity is they don't have time, I think, to do a lot of these things. And part of it is because they only work 2.5 days a week, because they need to be back home all the time, raising money for their re-elections. Wouldn't campaign finance reform potentially give Congress more time to work? I know some of them don't want to work, but those who do, a system of, say, no limits full disclosure, where you're not putting together $1 million in $2,600 increments. Is campaign finance reform perhaps one way to give Congress more capacity?
I'm going to dodge that question by offering a different suggestion, which is not original to me. I've never worked in Congress and probably never will. But the problem seems to be, from what I understand and what I hear from those who do work in Congress, is constituents are the problem. Not, I should backtrack. Maybe I should have tackled your campaign finance question instead. But not saying there's anything wrong with constituents, but members are burdened with being responsive to constituents, and they need more staff to handle constituent work because they want to be responsive to the constituents, and then free up some staff to actually become more expert in policy and free up time for the member to become more expert in policy. And this requires enlarging the staff of the Congress. Now, Congress doesn't like doing it because they like to seem like they're tough on big government and wasteful spending, so why not cut it home? Cut Congress's budget. That's a huge mistake. That is very, very short-sighted, because if Congress doesn't do it, then the agencies are going to do it. And that's a lot worse and is going to waste a lot more of our money. Would campaign finance reform help this problem? Sure it would, if it weren't unconstitutional. That's the hurt. But in a constitutionally possible realm, we should focus on the constituency aspects, enlarging the staff of Congress.
But you misunderstood me. I want to do it in a constitutional direction. So no limits, not impose more of it, scrap the whole system.
So he didn't have the mic on him, but I misunderstood his question. He was saying we should scrap all limits to campaign finance so you can cut in full disclosure and get big checks from people, and that will free up time. Yeah, I think that's probably more constitutional than the current system, and it certainly would resolve that problem. But I reserve the right to change my opinion.
Is there a final question? Yes, please.
Thanks, you guys, for your presentation. So my question is kind of specific, but you have various examples of courts striking down agency regulation for acting outside their authority. You have various members of Congress often frustrated that they feel like agencies are acting outside their jurisdiction. So do you have a suggestion for a way, absent going to court, absent changing Chevron deference, that there's something that legislators can do on the front end in legislative text to try to rein in some of this outgrowth of the administrative state that members and some courts agree they're exceeding their statutory authority?
Stay late in markup sessions and continue to argue with people that are either friends that have a kind of a better approach or foes that don't want to do it or want to do more of it, and actually make a decision. Make a hard decision. And there are lots. Charles Calaveras has put together a program for reforming bank regulation by having intelligent capital standards that are incentive compatible. He's been working on this for years. You could actually put it in legislation. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have, just say, I can't figure this out. It's really, really complicated, and you and I disagree. So why don't we just say the Federal Reserve Board will come up with sound and adequate capital standards and send us annual reports on what it is doing, okay? I'd say we have to educate ourselves, learn a little bit more about capital standards, and sit around and work harder. We're never going to, we're always going to review new drugs in the United States. The public favors it unanimously, and you and I can't do it in Congress. That's going to be a big piece of power in the executive branch. There are a lot of things like that, but there are many, many, many cases where you could have agreements that don't have a strong, where people that were actually dedicated to collective choice and sitting down and coming up with hard decisions, with hard standards, could do it. It just takes a lot of time. But read the OSHA statute, read the EPA statute. It's filled with, the standard is like a paragraph, and it kind of starts out going in this direction, and then it goes over in that direction. And it's because they took everybody's idea and just made a sentence out of it, or a couple of sentences out of it. There are other things, automobile pollution standards, where in the good old days at least, there was one national standard, and Congress actually, the number was there in the statute. It can be done, but I think that there's no other solution than that.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Well, I think it was a useful discussion. It's obviously the start of something which one hopes will continue. Your part in this can be important. You work, many of you, in the Congress who work on these issues. We have to keep those issues about the rule of law up in the front of the discussion here, and eventually perhaps we'll get some changes that will be for the better. Thank you very much for coming.